The Narrative of Canada Modern History. By Ahmed Khorshid. Genre: History. Target audience: general readers, students, history enthusiasts, new Canadians. Style: narrative nonfiction/educational. Model: GPT-5 Nano. The Narrative of Canada Modern History 1. Chapter 1, Introduction, Framing Canada's Modern History 3. Chapter 2, The Land and its First Inhabitants 3. Chapter 3, From Colonies to Confederation, The Making of a Dominion 6. Chapter 4, Expanding Horizons, Nation Building Across a Vast Land 10. Chapter 5, War, Work, and the Home Front 13. Chapter 6, Between Revolutions and Reforms, the Interwar Era 17. Chapter 7, The Quiet Transformation, Postwar Prosperity and Social Change 21. Chapter 8, Quebec and the National Question 25. Chapter 9, Global Ties and Domestic Transitions 28. Chapter 10, Diversity as Strength, the Multicultural Shift 32. Chapter 11, Environment, Resources, and a Changing Climate 35. Chapter 12, Technology, Innovation, and the Everyday 39. Chapter 13, Public Life, Media, and Democracy 43. Chapter 14, Reconciliation, Rights, and a Shared Future 47. Chapter 15, Canada in the Global Century 51. Chapter 16, Conclusion, Weaving the Threads into a Living Narrative 54. Chapter 1, Introduction, Framing Canada's Modern History. Sections. Section 1.1, Why Canada Now? Framing a Modern National Narrative. Section 1.2, Voices at the Center, Indigenous, French, English, and Newcomers. Section 1.3, The Narrative Nonfiction Approach, Balancing Story and Evidence. Section 1.4, Reading Pathways, What You'll Take Away and How to Use This Book. Canada today is a country that feels almost braided from many threads. The purpose of this chapter is not to map every thread in full detail, but to show how they weave a single, evolving tapestry. By framing the modern moment, we set a lens through which later chapters can illuminate both quiet everyday acts and watershed events. Think of this as the compass that helps readers navigate a landscape that is at once intimate and expansive. The modern Canadian story invites us to look beyond single origin narratives and to ask, who is included, who is listening, and who is answering back. This chapter lays a foundation for understanding how Indigenous histories, Francophone perspectives, English-speaking experiences, and new arrivals converge, clash, and collaborate in shaping public life. It is through that convergence, and its tensions, that Canada earns its current identity. This framing helps us read institutions, memory, and change with clarity and curiosity. As we begin, you'll notice a deliberate balance, a steady practical thread about how history is made, paired with human-scale storytelling that makes numbers and dates feel alive. The aim is to sustain attention without sacrificing accuracy. The chapters that follow will deepen these threads with concrete examples, voices, and sources, always anchored in a careful, human-centered approach. 1.1 Why Canada Now? Framing a Modern National Narrative. Canada's present-day moment emerges from a long conversation among many peoples and memories. It is a moment defined by rapid change, but not by novelty alone. It is shaped by legacies that still echo in classrooms, courtrooms, and community halls. This section asks readers to see modern Canada as a work in progress, continuously revised by new arrivals and evolving Indigenous governance, language policies, and civic rituals. The goal is to frame the narrative so readers can recognize continuity amid disruption. The Why Now question invites three threads to guide our understanding. First, the country is home to a diverse population whose everyday life writes new chapters in immigration, settlement, and cultural exchange. Second, constitutional and political reforms ask how rights, representation, and responsibility are shared across provinces, territories, and nations. Third, global challenges, economic shifts, climate change, and digital information flows, press Canada to redefine its role on the world stage. Together, these threads create a modern Canadian narrative that is both practical and aspirational. To frame the history clearly, we approach structure as a tool, not a trap. We trace moments when decisions mattered, and we show how ordinary people contributed to them, teachers, nurses, entrepreneurs, Indigenous leaders, and newcomers alike. By focusing on processes, policy choices, negotiations, and memory, without losing sight of lived experience, we keep the story honest and accessible. This approach is not about presenting a verdict, it is about inviting readers into the work of understanding a complex and changing country. 1.2 Voices at the center: Indigenous, French, English, and newcomers. No national story is complete without listening to its primary voices. Indigenous nations have long histories on this land, with legal traditions, languages, and governance practices that predate Confederation and keep evolving today. The French and English strands trace a centuries-long conversation about language, law, and identity, with communities that stretch from Quebec to the Maritimes and beyond. Newcomers from every corner of the globe entered Canada's story at different moments, each bringing distinct hopes, skills, and cultural practices. The book foregrounds these four strands not as parallel tracks but as intersecting streams. Indigenous perspectives illuminate sovereignty, treaties, and long-standing relationships to land and governance. Francophone communities, whether in Quebec, New Brunswick, Ontario, or the Prairies, reveal different histories of bilingual policy, education, and cultural expression. Anglophone experiences show how provincial and federal dynamics shape governance, industry, and social life. Newcomers, through waves of migration, contribute to labor markets, urban culture, and new forms of community organization. When readers hear these voices together, the narrative gains texture, nuance, and a more honest map of Canada's contemporary reality. This approach is practical as well as ethical. Each section of the book will not only recount events but also ask how these voices have asserted rights, negotiated identity, and shaped policy. By centering Indigenous and newcomer experiences alongside long-standing language communities, the reader gains a more complete sense of who Canada is today, and who is helping to write its future. The goal is to create a conversation that respects memory, acknowledges conflict, and seeks common ground. 1.3 The narrative nonfiction approach: balancing story and evidence. Narrative nonfiction anchors factual material in human experience. It uses scenes, voices, and concrete details to illuminate broader forces such as policy shifts, economic change, and social movements. In practice, this means letting archival documents, oral histories, and official records breathe through well-told scenes that illuminate meaning without sacrificing accuracy. The result is a form that feels both readable and responsibly sourced. Balancing story and evidence requires transparency about sources and methods. We triangulate material from multiple kinds of records: government archives, court decisions, newspapers, and community memory. We also acknowledge contested narratives and present them with careful context, so readers can weigh competing claims themselves. This approach honors curiosity, it invites questions, it invites dialogue, and it invites readers to test ideas against evidence. The chapter treats memory as a resource, not a substitute for facts. Ethics and craft guide the storytelling as well. The writing aims to respect communities' own voices, avoid caricature, and resist sensationalism. Readers should feel invited into the process, not pushed toward a single interpretation. By combining narrative clarity with rigorous sourcing, the book aspires to be useful for classrooms, personal inquiry, and public discussion alike. 1.4 Reading Pathways: what you'll take away and how to use this book. This book offers a flexible journey through Canada's modern history. Expect to gain a clear sense of how major moments connect to everyday life, and how ideas about rights, language, and belonging have shifted over time. You'll also develop the ability to read critically, to compare sources, to weigh competing claims, and to recognize the role of memory in shaping policy. The aim is not to exhaust every topic but to equip you with guiding questions and a framework for further exploration. You can read linearly to follow a chronological thread, or hop across chapters to trace recurring themes such as governance, identity, and inclusion. Each section is designed to stand on its own, while also linking to others through shared questions and case studies. The book includes practical tools to aid study and reflection, brief summaries, key terms, and recommended readings for deeper dives. Use these pathways to tailor the reading to your interests, whether you are a student, a general reader, a history enthusiast, or a new Canadian exploring the past to better understand the present. In this spirit, anticipate a rhythm. Chapters open with a framing question, move through voices and evidentiary scenes, and close with reflections that connect past and present. The structure is meant to feel conversational yet accountable, so conversations about Canada's modern history can move from the page into classrooms, debates, and everyday life. The result is a book that invites you to think, discuss, and apply what you learn to your own experiences and communities. The chapters ahead will build on these foundations, expanding the conversation with case studies, archival voices, and thoughtful analysis. You'll see how memory shapes policy, how competing claims are negotiated, and how ordinary acts, education, work, community service, become the engines of national change. By keeping a clear frame, a diverse chorus, and a careful balance of narrative and evidence, this book aims to feel both intimate and authoritative. In that balance lies the value for readers who want to understand Canada not as a fixed myth but as a living, evolving story. Chapter 2: The Land and its First Inhabitants. Sections. Section 2.1: Deep Time on a Continent, Diverse Nations, Shared Landscapes. Section 2.2: First Encounters, Trade Routes, Diplomacy, and Cultural Exchange. Section 2.3: Transformation Under Pressure, Contact, Change, and Displacement. Section 2.4: Legacies in the Land, How Early History Shaped Present Realities. Introduction. Canada's story begins long before cities and confederations. The land itself carries memories of ice, rivers, and countless communities who learned to read the weather, the seasons, and the living pulse of place. This chapter explores the deep time of a continent, the nations who thrived across varied landscapes, and the transformative moments when contact with new peoples began to reshape life on the ground. Our aim is to listen for the voices of those who tended these lands for millennia and to connect their legacies to the Canada we know today. Section 2.1: Deep Time on a Continent, Diverse Nations, Shared Landscapes. Long before Europeans set foot on these shores, diverse Indigenous nations inhabited every corner of the land. The continent's vast sprawl, tundra, boreal forests, plains, mountains, and coastlines, brought a corresponding tapestry of cultures, languages, and social systems. Yet there was a shared skill, reading place. From spring ice-outs that opened river routes to the salmon runs that stitched coastal economies, communities learned to move, trade, and care for the land in ways that respected its limits and generosity. In that sense, different nations existed with distinct traditions, while the landscapes they inhabited offered a common grammar of seasonal rounds, kinship networks, and stewardship. Across regions, the names and boundaries of nations varied, but the deep logic of belonging remained. The Arctic and subarctic boreal world shaped the Inuit and many Dene-speaking peoples, who mastered travel by sea and ice, caribou migrations, and the intimate knowledge of northern fauna. The western forests and mountains gave rise to Coast Salish, Haida, and related nations whose maritime routes linked villages through dugout canoes and longhouses. In the Heartland and Great Lakes corridors, Anishinaabe, Cree, and Iroquoian-speaking communities forged complex governance and ceremonial life around forests, rivers, and copper sources. In the east, the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and numerous Algonquian-speaking groups built seasonal economies around the Atlantic coast and inland rivers. Across these vast scales, Indigenous peoples shaped their world with a precision born of enduring observation and communal memory. The land's diversity and the people's ingenuity created a continent of shared landscapes rather than a mosaic of isolated pockets. Fire, water, soil, and stone formed the stage on which countless lifeways evolved. The result is a history in which difference is ordinary and place sense is sacred, where a nation might speak with many voices, yet all echo the same obligation, to live well with the land that sustains life. Section 2.2: First Encounters, Trade Routes, Diplomacy, and Cultural Exchange. Trade networks connected communities across vast distances long before written treaties or colonial courts existed. Goods moved along seasonal routes through rivers, lakes, coastlines, and overland trails, weaving an economy of exchange as intricate as any empire. Copper from the Lake Superior region moved toward the eastern woodlands, shells and beads traveled from Atlantic shores to inland markets, and the knowledge of seasons, climate, and hunting cycles flowed as freely as traded goods. Diplomacy was often as important as barter, with kinship ties and ceremonial exchanges creating durable bonds that transcended distance. Encounters with Europeans began as a trickle and then accelerated into a flood of new possibilities and new tensions. The Norse presence at Vinland around the year 1000 stands as a rare early moment of contact, reminding us that the continent's doors to others have long been open, and sometimes only ajar. Later, French and British explorers and traders would reshape trade patterns, especially in the fur economy, which drew indigenous and settler communities into complex partnerships and struggles over land and sovereignty. In many indigenous cultures, diplomacy took material form in belts, wampum, and rituals that codified agreements and recorded memory. The two-row wampum, for example, became a powerful symbol of living treaty and mutual respect, signaling a path of parallel existence rather than domination. Trade and diplomacy were never only about goods, they were about knowledge, languages, and ideas. Indigenous stewards shared ecological knowledge that enhanced resource management, while European technologies, metal tools, firearms, horses, transformed what communities could achieve. The result was a dynamic, evolving pattern of exchange that left a lasting imprint on the land, the people, and the political imagination of what Canada could become. Section 2.3, Transformation under Pressure, Contact, Change, and Displacement. Contact brought rapid transformation, often paired with hardship and upheaval. New diseases, ecological pressures, and shifting power dynamics altered the landscape of Indigenous life in ways that were neither simple nor uniformly felt. Communities adapted by reconfiguring social structures, adopting new technologies, and reinterpreting traditional practices in light of changing circumstances. Some groups formed new alliances or expanded their territorial horizons, while others faced encroachments that gradually narrowed their options for living on the land. The fur trade, in particular, drew Indigenous and non-Indigenous traders into a network that stretched from the Atlantic to the interior. Métis communities emerged at frontier crossroads where European and Indigenous worlds met, cultivating distinct cultures that blended speech, song, and craft. Pressure from settlers and governments intensified in the 18th and 19th centuries, with treaties, land cessions, and reserve systems shaping who could live where and under what terms. Yet resilience endured, languages and ceremonial life persisted, and Indigenous governance adapted to a rapidly changing political order. The chapter of transformation is not merely one of loss, it is also a testament to the creativity and endurance that allowed communities to hold onto identity even as landscapes and laws shifted around them. Section 2.4, Legacies in the Land, How Early Histories Shape Present Realities. The earliest histories of Indigenous peoples continue to define Canada's present. Place names, ongoing language revival, and enduring stewardship traditions anchor modern life in a longer, more nuanced memory of the land. The treaty era and the later codification of Indigenous rights in law created pathways for self-governance, land claims, and negotiated coexistence with the state. Today, many communities exercise governance structures rooted in age-old practices, while also engaging with contemporary constitutional frameworks, courts, and international standards for human rights. These legacies extend beyond law and policy. Indigenous knowledge about fire regimes, watershed management, and biodiversity enriches national conversations about climate and land use. Cultural memory persists in art, music, storytelling, and education, inviting all Canadians to see the land not as a backdrop to history but as a living partner in it. As Canada continues to reckon with its past and chart a more inclusive future, the old connections to land remain a guiding compass, reminding us that the story of a country is inseparable from the stories of the people who first tended its soil. Closing reflection. The land remembers its first inhabitants in every corner of Canada, in the names we use for places, in the forests that still read like calendars of season and harvest, and in the ways communities continue to steward and defend their places. If we listen closely, the earliest chapters of this country speak with clarity about responsibility, collaboration, and respect for life in all its forms. By grounding our present in that long memory, we can better understand how to build a future that honors both the land and its first peoples.
Chapter 3, From Colonies to Confederation, The Making of a Dominion. Sections. Section 3.1, Seeds of Unity, Ideas, Federalism, and the Path to Confederation. Section 3.2, Debates in the Rooms Where Nations Are Begun. Section 3.3, Building Institutions, The Framework of a New Country. Section 3.4, Early Tests of Nationhood, Unity, Diversity, and Governance. Introduction. Across the mid-19th century Atlantic-facing colonies of British North America, a quiet but powerful question took hold: could disparate places with distinct traditions become a single, workable nation? The era demanded more than ambition, it required a practical architecture for government, defense, and trade. Confederation emerged as a negotiated blend of ideals, compromises, and stubborn regional realities. This chapter traces how seeds of unity took root, how fierce debates shaped a national framework, how durable institutions were built, and how early tests of nationhood tested the new dominion's balance of unity and diversity. Section 3.1, Seeds of Unity, Ideas, Federalism, and the Path to Confederation. The idea of unity grew from two converging pressures, economic necessity and political reform. A railroad-linked inland federation promised to knit distant communities into a single market and a common defense. At the same time, provincial governments in Canada West, Ontario, and Canada East, Quebec, sought a constitutional system that could preserve local rights while avoiding perpetual deadlock. Federalism offered a language of compromise, shared powers for a central government and distinct powers for provinces. Thoughts about governance circulated like a set of interlocking gears. A strong central government could coordinate defense, railways, and tariffs, while provinces would retain control over education, property, and local laws. The philosophical pivot was simple in principle but stubborn in practice: balance unity with regional autonomy. The men and women who carried these ideas had to imagine a country that could survive the pressures of distance, population, and competing interests. The result would be less a single blueprint and more a flexible framework, capable of absorbing new voices over time. The path toward Confederation began in earnest with key turning points in 1864. The Charlottetown Conference, originally convened to discuss maritime concerns, shifted toward a broader vision of union in what became known as Confederation's first major moment. The following weeks produced the Great Coalition in Canada West, a pragmatic alliance between John A. Macdonald and Georges-Étienne Cartier that broke parliamentary deadlock and redirected politics toward union. The Quebec Conference of 1864 then distilled these conversations into a preliminary framework, later refined at London in 1866. The resulting set of agreements would become the constitutional backbone of a new dominion. A simple metaphor helps: Confederation was not a finished bridge but a scaffold laid across a widening river. The railways would knit the country together, the Constitution would bind its parts with common rules, and the shared identity would slowly take shape as citizens learned to see themselves as Canadians first, and then as residents of a province or region. The seeds of unity were planted in real-world negotiations, with practical benefits, security, trade, and a shared future, guiding stubborn disagreements toward workable compromises. Section 3.2, Debates in the Rooms Where Nations Are Begun. The rooms where nations begin are places of rhetoric, bargaining, and high-stakes compromise. Debates focused on how power would be distributed between a central government and the provinces, and how representation would mirror both population and place. Canada West wanted a system that could scale with growth, while Canada East pressed for protections for minority languages and regional identity. The central tension was economic and strategic: who would call the shots, and who would keep a voice at the table. A central sticking point was representation. Canada's framers sought a mix: a House of Commons where seats reflected population, and a Senate that guaranteed provincial parity. This arrangement would prevent rural provinces from being overwhelmed by larger ones while giving provinces a steady voice in national affairs. Maritime concerns amplified the need for safeguards. Halifax, St. John, and Fredericton watched closely to ensure their perspectives would not be drowned out by more populous centers. The negotiations also revolved around the scope of federal authority, defense, trade, and national infrastructure versus education, property, and civil rights at the provincial level. Personal alliances and political calculus shaped the final architecture. Figures who disagreed, yet understood the necessity of unity, worked behind closed doors, turning verbal sparring into constitutional design. The rooms echoed with visions of a nation built on cooperation rather than conquest. The agreements forged here were not mere documents, they were commitments to a shared project, one that would take time to mature and endure. The spiritual heartbeat of these debates was the desire to protect distinct communities while enabling common prosperity. Language, faith, and local customs mattered because they defined who could participate in the national conversation. The result was a constitution designed to tolerate difference while binding citizens under shared laws and institutions. In this sense, the rooms where nations are begun were also rooms of mutual repayment. Each party gave a little so the whole could grow stronger. Section 3.3, building institutions, the framework of a new country. The legal and political framework of Confederation began with the British North America Act and the creation of a two-tier system of government. A federal parliament would enact nationwide policies, while provincial legislatures would retain authority over local matters. The Act established key institutions, the House of Commons and the Senate to represent population and province respectively, a Governor-General as the Crown's representative, and a cabinet-led executive responsible to the legislature. These pieces formed a new order in which power flowed through a system of responsible government and constitutional checks. The four founding provinces, Ontario, Canada West, Quebec, Canada East, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, formed the core of the new Dominion. Ottawa emerged as a neutral capital, chosen in part for its location and its promise to be less a symbol of one region than a seat for the nation's governance. The constitutional design placed sensitive powers in parallel tracks, federal power over matters such as defense, trade, and citizenship, and provincial power over education, property and civil rights, and local governance. The architecture was not a single tool but a toolkit, ready to adapt as needs shifted with population growth and economic change. Behind the scenes, the machinery of governance began to take shape. A new public service crafted the routines of governance, from budgeting and procurement to diplomacy and law enforcement. A national judiciary, ultimately underscored by a developing federal court system, stood as the guardian of constitutional boundaries and the interpreter of federal and provincial powers. The chapter's birth of a national framework required more than a clever blueprint. It demanded the disciplined work of officials, lawyers, and legislators who could translate theory into administration. The result was a functioning governance ecosystem capable of sustaining a growing country. The institutional design also carried symbolic weight. The creation of a bicameral parliament, the establishment of equality among provinces in the Senate, and the presence of a neutral capital signaled a new kind of federation, one rooted in compromise, shared sovereignty, and a steady push toward national integration. The institutions would be tested by time, not simply by architectural elegance but by their ability to deliver stable governance and inclusive participation. This was the practical realization of the seeds and debates that preceded it, a country built to endure. Section 3.4 Early Tests of Nationhood, Unity, Diversity, and Governance. From the outset, the Dominion faced tests that would reveal how well its founders understood unity and how thoroughly diversity could be woven into governance. One early and instructive episode was the Red River and Manitoba story, where the Métis and Indigenous voices intersected with settler expansion and constitutional change. The Manitoba Act of 1870 created Manitoba as a province, partly to address Métis concerns, but it also highlighted ongoing tensions between competing visions of nationhood and the rights of Indigenous peoples and minority communities. This was not a single crisis but a prologue to ongoing negotiations about rights, representation, and land. Language, culture, and education loomed large as tests of national cohesion. The new Dominion had to accommodate a French-speaking population with a distinct legal and educational tradition, while integrating English-speaking settlers and newcomers. Settler governance could increasingly rely on bilingual and bicultural understandings, but the work of building trust continued long after the ink dried on the Act. The early years also underscored the challenge of nation-building across a vast geography where urban centers and rural landscapes operated on different tempos. Economically, the nation sought to knit itself together through policy choices that would encourage growth and settlement. The national policy of the 1870s aimed to protect Canadian industries, stimulate Western settlement, and finance the era's ambitious railway expansion. These choices, while stabilizing in the long run, required patience and sacrifice from communities with different economic bases. Governance had to respond to the needs of farmers in the Maritimes, laborers in Ontario, and traders in Quebec as the country's markets gradually aligned. Indigenous treaties and the legacy of Indigenous leadership also placed a burden on early Confederation. The relations forged in treaties would shape future political debates and policy choices for generations. The young Dominion learned that unity demanded more than political agreement, it demanded a continuing commitment to fair dealing, recognition of rights, and transparent governance. The early tests thus served as critical lessons in balancing unity with the region's diverse voices, a balancing act that would stay at the heart of Canadian political life for decades to come. Conclusion: the making of a dominion was less a single event than a sustained conversation across provinces, communities, and leaders. It required turning regional loyalties into a shared national project, while listening to the concerns of those who feared losing voice or place. The Confederation story shows how ideas, debates, institutions, and early trials can converge to form a durable political order, one that remains open to change as citizens reimagine what it means to be Canadian. The chapter's through line is clear: unity flourishes most when it is built on a framework that respects diversity, in which institutions survive by earning the trust of all communities they govern, and in which leadership remains committed to the long arc of national renewal.
Chapter 4: Expanding Horizons, Nation Building Across a Vast Land. Sections. Section 4.1: Rails, Rivers, and Roads, Infrastructure as Identity. Section 4.2: Immigrants and Settlers, Population Shifts and Cultural Beginnings. Section 4.3: Resource Winds, Economy, Extraction, and the Canadian Frontier. Section 4.4: Urban Awakening, Cities, Civic Life, and Public Culture. Introduction. Canada's story is a narrative of scale and connection. Stretching from coast to coast and from Arctic frontiers to bustling river towns, the country grew through lines drawn on maps and lives lived along shores and railways. Infrastructure, migration, resources, and urban life did not merely accompany expansion, they defined what the nation looked like and how its people imagined themselves as citizens. This chapter follows four threads that braided a continent-wide identity: the work of connecting places, the movement of people, the pull of resources, and the awakening of cities and public culture. 4.1: Rails, Rivers, and Roads, Infrastructure as Identity. Infrastructure in Canada has always been more than bricks and rails, it has been a statement about belonging. The Transcontinental Railway, completed in the 1880s, stitched together distant provinces and signaled national sovereignty in a nation of vast landscapes. The rails did not simply move goods, they carried ideas about who belonged to Canada and who helped build it. Alongside the rails, rivers and canals shaped routes of commerce, defense, and daily life, from early canal works to the Great Lakes St. Lawrence corridor that linked interior towns to world markets. Roads and telegraphs completed the picture of a connected nation. Early plank and dirt roads opened new settlements and enabled farmers to reach markets, while the telegraph whispered a new pace of national coordination. Infrastructure became a shared language, a way for provinces to speak with one another, for settlers to imagine a larger future, and for newcomers to sense opportunity. In truth, Canada's identity was being written in steel and stone as much as in laws and treaties. 4.2: Immigrants and Settlers, Population Shifts and Cultural Beginnings. The Canadian landscape attracted people who carried with them distinct languages, traditions, and hopes. Government policies, notably the Dominion Lands Act of 1872, encouraged settlement on the prairies and helped transform vast grasslands into a latticework of farms and towns. Immigration flowed in waves: British and Irish settlers in the early years, followed by diversifying streams from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Asia, each leaving a mark on local cultures and local economies. The era also bore painful episodes. Laborers, including Chinese workers who helped build the rails, faced discrimination and legal barriers that darkened the arc of immigration. Policies such as the Chinese head tax and later restrictions shaped who came and how they could participate in public life. Settlement brought cultural beginnings and complicated legacies. Prairie communities forged new identities around farming, schools, and churches, while urban centers absorbed this diversity into growing civic scenes. At the same time, Indigenous nations faced upheaval under settlement and policy, treaties, reserve systems, and attempts at assimilation altered traditional ways of life. The population shifts that accompanied colonization created a mosaic of languages, cuisines, and neighborhood rituals, laying the groundwork for a plural Canada even as they challenged Indigenous sovereignty and rights. 4.3: Resource Winds, Economy, Extraction, and the Canadian Frontier. Canada's frontier economies have long been powered by what lies beneath and around the land. Timber, mineral wealth, and later energy resources drew people to new towns and left lasting marks on regional identities. In mining belts such as Sudbury and the Western Cordillera, minerals defined local futures and drew workers from far afield, turning isolated settlements into industrial hubs. The story of coal, nickel, and other resources is a story of risk and opportunity, where discoveries could transform a quiet village into a boomtown almost overnight. Energy and resource development reshaped the country's geography and its politics. Hydro-powered projects unlocked growth in communities along rivers and in the north, while discoveries of oil in Alberta in the mid-20th century opened a new era of economic diversification and migration. The Klondike and Western mining booms also fostered a sense of daring, reinforcing Canada's image as a continent of opportunity. Across these sectors, resource extraction anchored trade networks, funded public institutions, and sometimes sparked conflicts over land, rights, and the distribution of profits. 4.4 Urban awakening, cities, civic life, and public culture. Urban centers emerged as laboratories of democracy and culture. As populations concentrated in cities, streets and parks became shared spaces where civic life unfolded. Libraries, schools, courts, and markets became the stage for daily citizenship. Streetcars and later automobiles reshaped how people moved within and between neighborhoods, enabling workers to live farther from their workplaces and fueling the growth of diverse districts. Public culture, newspapers, theaters, museums, and sports clubs built a sense of city identity and offered a space for communal reflection and entertainment. The era also witnessed social and political tensions that accompanied modernization. Labor movements, strikes, and debates over working conditions highlighted the evolving relationship between citizens and government. Yet this period also produced enduring institutions, universities, public libraries, and municipal planning that aimed to make cities livable and inclusive. Urban life fostered a shared Canadian consciousness, a recognition that the nation's strength lay not only in its vast spaces but in the communities that animate them. Conclusion: the chapters of infrastructure, migration, resource wealth, and urban culture are not separate stories but interwoven threads of a single national tapestry. Rails and rivers created routes, immigrants and settlers filled the map with living communities, resource winds funded growth and brought new rhythms of life, cities turned those rhythms into civic culture. Taken together, they reveal a Canada built by people who imagined a larger future and then labored to realize it, one town, one river, one railway at a time. As readers, new Canadians and long-time residents alike can see how each thread still informs the way communities plan, argue, welcome, and celebrate together. Chapter 5, War, Work, and the Home Front. Sections. Section 5.1, Global Tides, War, Commerce, and the Canadian World. Section 5.2, Soldiers, Families, and Society, the Human Toll and Transformation. Section 5.3, Women at Work and Social Change, Shifts in Status and Role. Section 5.4, Postwar Reforms, Economies Rebuilt, Communities Reimagined. War touched Canada in ways that went far beyond battles. It redefined what it meant to be a nation, pulling resources, people, and ideas into a single, vast project. This chapter follows 4 strands: how global conflict braided Canada into a world-scale economy, the human toll that touched soldiers, families, and communities, the dramatic shifts in women's work and social standing, and the post-war reforms that rebuilt economies and reimagined communities. Read together, they reveal a Canada that learned to endure, adapt, and redefine its place in the world. Section 5.1, Global Tides, War, Commerce, and the Canadian World. Canada's story of the 20th century moves in concert with global conflict. When war erupts abroad, Canada shifts from a largely agrarian, resource-holding province of the British Empire into a nation that mobilizes industry, labor, and land to support a broader war effort. The war economy matter-of-factly reorders production: wheat, pulp and timber, coal, and munitions rise to meet wartime demand, while railways and shipping lanes shoulder volumes they were not built to carry. In this sense, war becomes a catalyst that threads Canada into a world that runs on supply lines and strategic choices. Trade and shipping bind Canada to the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The seas become highways of life and risk, convoys, port cities, and inland mills pulse with activity as goods move to support Allied forces. The country's resources, grain to feed soldiers, timber and metals for weapons, and farm machinery to sustain production, turn Canadian ports into nodes of a global network. The result is a Canadian economy that grows more interdependent with global currents, as the country's own geography, vast lands, long distances, and access to 2 oceans, becomes a strategic asset. As nations marshal power, Canada's sense of identity also shifts. The war years pushed the Dominion toward greater autonomy within the imperial framework, while Parliament and ordinary Canadians increasingly shaped decisions about mobilization, censorship, and economic control. The experience of wartime governance, the demands of conscription debates, and the pressure to adapt industrially move Canada away from a strictly dependent role toward one that speaks with growing confidence on the world stage. In short, global tides redraw the map of Canadian responsibility and possibility. The domestic economy, the overseas commitments, and the moral debates inside Parliament converge in a single through line. Canada learns to translate resource abundance into strategic usefulness, and in doing so, forges a modern national self-understanding. This is not just about war materials or revenue, it is about how a country sees itself when called to contribute to something larger than itself. The result is a Canada that learns to balance national priorities with international obligations, a balance that will continue to shape policy well after the guns fall silent. Section 5.2, Soldiers, Families, and Society, the Human Toll and Transformation. The commitment to war demands a human price. For soldiers, the front lines are matched by quiet, private spaces back home where families wait, endure, and recalibrate their lives. Letters, parcels, and telegrams carry the pace of the conflict into kitchens and living rooms, turning ordinary routines into acts of endurance. The absence of loved ones reshapes neighborhoods, schools, and local economies, as men depart, leaving behind both emotional silence and practical gaps that families must fill. The home front bears a parallel burden of transformation. As men join the armed forces, women, youth, and aging workers step into roles once considered outside their purview. Factories, farms, and hospitals hum with activity, and the intimate economy of households shifts toward collective purpose. The human toll, measured in lives cut short, injuries borne, and the long shadow of trauma, produces lasting changes in how communities support veterans and bereaved families. The war's emotional geography becomes part of the national memory, shaping conversations about care, remembrance, and responsibility for those who return. The social fabric also experiences strain and adaptation. The scale of missing neighbors, the fear of danger, and the strain of rationing pressure everyday life, creating a society that measures sacrifice in small, concrete practices, reduced consumption, cooperative farming, and communal relief. When victory arrives, the country confronts reconciliation, the needs of those who bore the heaviest costs, and the work of reintegration. The human story of war thus becomes a story of resilience, how families and communities learn to rebuild in the wake of loss, and how a nation emerges with a renewed sense of obligation to those who have given so much. War also reshapes concepts of identity and belonging. The influx of veterans and the changes in family structures prompt new conversations about work, education, and social support. The experience of conflict leaves a lasting imprint on Canadian values, a stronger impulse toward collective responsibility, a willingness to invest in veterans and their families, and a recognition that national strength rests on the well-being of ordinary people as well as on military prowess. In this light, the human toll is not solely about casualties, it is also about the capacity to transform pain into a more inclusive vision of national life. Section 5.3, Women at Work and Social Change, Shifts in Status and Role. War compresses time and expands opportunity for women. As men leave for the front, women step into factory floors, farms, clinics, and supply chains that keep the nation functioning. These are not temporary positions snatched from the margins, they are central roles that redefine what productive work looks like in everyday life. The munitions plants, farm cooperatives, and hospital wards become laboratories of skill, efficiency, and solidarity, showing that women can manage complex operations, steward critical resources, and sustain families under stress. Alongside industrial labor, women engage in organized service, nurses, volunteers, and community organizers whose work keeps morale and health afloat. The wartime period accelerates the public visibility of women's capabilities, and their contributions begin to alter expectations about women's place in the workforce and in civic life. The social shifts during and after the war ripple into education, public policy, and political dialogue, moving conversations about gender roles from private households toward the public sphere where laws and norms are shaped. The journey toward greater equality advances unevenly, with setbacks and incremental gains alike. Women gain new leverage in the workplace, in local communities, and in the political realm, even as they continue to navigate uneven pay, shifting job classifications, and the balancing act of family responsibilities. The wartime years lay groundwork for broader suffrage and social reforms, as advocates for women's employment rights and political participation build on the momentum created by the war's demands. In this sense, the home front becomes a proving ground for women's leadership and for a more expansive vision of citizenship. Wider social change traces through the suffrage story as well. Federally, women win the right to vote in many provinces, and nationwide progress culminates in a more inclusive political culture by the mid-century. The war's upheavals also spur new norms around public life. Women become more visible in decision-making circles, in schools, and in workplaces, reshaping expectations about career possibilities and social contribution. The integration of women into paid labor and public life is not merely a wartime anomaly, it seeds a durable transformation in how families organize work, how communities mobilize, and how national identity is imagined. Section 5.4, Postwar Reforms, Economies Rebuilt, Communities Reimagined. The end of war marks not a conclusion but a transition, the moment when urgency shifts from victory to recovery and renewal. Demobilization challenges soldiers returning to civilian life and requires new pathways for education, housing, and employment. The state and civil society collaborate to design programs that translate wartime discipline and industrial capacity into peacetime prosperity. Reintegration policies, veterans' benefits, and public investment in housing and infrastructure become the scaffolding for a post-war Canada that seeks to balance growth with social protection. The seeds of the welfare state take clearer form in the post-war era. Family allowances, housing loans, and expanded social services emerge as instruments to support families, particularly those rebuilding after the devastation of war. While Canada will later broaden its welfare programs, these early reforms establish a recognizable pattern. The state plays a more active role in smoothing economic shocks and ensuring a basic level of security for families. The effect is both practical and symbolic, a public commitment to shared prosperity that reflects wartime experience and the desire for a more stable society. Economies reorganize around peacetime industries while still drawing on wartime lessons. The push to diversify beyond staple industries, agriculture, mining, and timber, takes hold as firms modernize, adopt new technologies, and expand into consumer goods, transportation, and services. Immigration and interprovincial movement shape demographic change, fueling urban growth, regional development, and cultural exchange. Communities reimagine themselves, towns once defined by war production pivot to civilian industries, cultural life, and education, while veterans, families, and new Canadians contribute to a richer, more complex national tapestry. In reflection, the post-war era crystallizes a national vision that acknowledges past sacrifice while charting a course toward lasting social and economic resilience. The revived economy, the redefined role of workers and caregivers, and the ongoing push for social supports reveal a Canada learning to balance ambition with responsibility. The war's legacy, practical reforms, renewed civic purpose, and a more robust sense of national belonging, continues to shape policy, identity, and everyday life for generations. This chapter has traced how war, work, and the home front collectively transformed Canada. The nation's story in the 20th century is not a simple chronology of battles and legislation, it is a narrative of people, soldiers and civilians, workers and thinkers, who reimagined what it means to build a country where conflict and peace coexisted, and where the promise of a better future could be pursued through collective effort and enduring hope.
Chapter 6, Between Revolutions and Reforms, the Interwar Era. Sections. Section 6.1, Economic Upheavals and Policy Experiments. Section 6.2, Arts, Culture, and Public Life in a Time of Change. Section 6.3, Expanding the State, Welfare, Rights, and Institutions. Section 6.4, Global Tensions, Domestic Choices, and National Direction. The interwar years in Canada are a story of tension and transformation. Nations around the world wrestled with the wreckage of war, economic collapse, and the uneasy birth of new political ideologies. Canada stood poised between the impulses of upheaval and the patient work of reform, building institutions and traditions that would shape its modern identity. This chapter traces how economic shocks, cultural renewal, state development, and global pressures intersected to push Canada toward a more active role for the citizen, the market, and the state. Section 6.1, Economic Upheavals and Policy Experiments. The post-war period unsettled millions, even as some communities experienced moments of prosperity. Returning soldiers, displaced workers, and farmers facing drought and falling prices created a patchwork economy in which too many stories repeated, sudden boom followed by abrupt bust. The 1920s brought a mixed banner of growth in resource sectors and towns, but the Great Depression turned that banner to ash for many households. Policymakers faced a crowded table of competing ideas, protective tariffs, public works, and experiments in social relief, all aimed at stitching together a national safety net from diverse provincial fabrics. By the mid to late 1930s, the scale of hardship demanded deeper reforms. The federal government and provinces experimented with relief and employment programs, while new political movements pressed for different economic orders. In this crucible, Canada established lasting mechanisms that would reshape its economic governance. The Bank of Canada, created in the 1930s and beginning operations in 1935, offered a centralized tool for monetary policy and financial stability. The emergence of coordinated relief discussions, such as Ottawa's early meetings to address Depression-era needs, highlighted a growing belief that policy could and should be deliberate rather than purely reactive. The period also saw the rise of alternative political voices. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, CCF, formed in 1932, and the social credit movement in the western provinces argued for bolder social and monetary reforms. These groups pressed governments to rethink how prosperity could be shared and how wealth could be organized for the common good. The conversations around federal-provincial responsibilities culminated in commissions like the Rowell-Suarez Inquiry, 1937-39, which urged a more integrated approach to social welfare, fiscal equalization, and national economic strategy. In short, the era turned crisis into a classroom. Canadian policymakers learned to diagnose problems, test ideas, and scale successful experiments. These upheavals yielded a durable lesson: economic resilience in a modern democracy requires both policy experimentation and social consent. The Depression's pressure did not erase regional differences, it reframed them. Yet it also seeded a shift toward more intentional economic planning and a greater role for national institutions in steering growth and safeguarding citizens during hard times. The interwar years thus set the stage for a more interventionist state, one that would balance markets with public responsibility in the decades to come. Section 6.2: Arts, Culture, and Public Life in a Time of Change. Culture in the interwar era became a lens for reimagining Canada's place in the world. Artists and writers sought landscapes and stories that felt distinctly Canadian, not borrowed from European models alone. The Group of Seven, with their audacious canvases of northern light and wide skies, helped forge a visual language that connected Canadians to the land they inhabited. Their work did more than decorate galleries, it offered a shared vocabulary for national identity at a moment when population centers were spread across vast regions and new media were expanding the public's reach. Literature and film joined the conversation, as writers and storytellers sought voices that could carry a broader Canadian experience to readers and listeners. The rise of radio as a common public square transformed daily life, turning households into shared spaces where news, music, and drama traveled with astonishing speed. The CBC's formation in the mid-1930s, building on earlier radio commissions, gave Canadians a national platform for programming that reflected regional diversity while reinforcing common civic bonds. Public life in this era became a dialogue between local experience and national narratives, a dialogue that could bridge rural farms, wartime industries, and cosmopolitan cities. Visual arts, theater, and cinema all contributed to a heightened sense of cultural purpose. The late 1930s saw the emergence of documentary and public interest storytelling that tied art to civic life, including film projects and government-supported broadcasts that sought to educate as well as entertain. The growth of cultural institutions and programming helped deepen a sense of belonging among Canadians with diverse backgrounds and origins. In this climate, culture did not simply reflect change, it helped propel it, offering Americans, Britons, and newcomers a way to understand Canada's evolving social and political landscape. As cultural currents moved outward, public life grew more inclusive in intention if not yet in practice. Women's voices in the arts, education, and civic organizations gained more prominence, contributing to a broader sense of citizenship. The arts, radio, and film worked together to create public conversations about identity, community, and responsibilities, conversations that would continue to shape policy choices and national self-understanding long after the interwar era ended. In this sense, culture was not a backdrop but a motor. It helped Canadians imagine a more capacious public sphere and a more confident national future. Section 6.3, Expanding the State, Welfare, Rights, and Institutions. The interwar era is best understood as a turning point in the state's responsibilities toward its citizens. Progressive-era ideals about rights and welfare began to settle into practice, even as political and regional tensions complicated their universal application. The expansion of state functions during this period was incremental rather than revolutionary, yet the cumulative effect was transformative. Citizens began to expect and rely on some level of public support for security in old age, illness, unemployment, and hardship. Legislation and policymaking reflected a new consensus about the social contract. Older generations had already witnessed the beginnings of pension schemes, while new generations demanded more reliable support during downturns. The federal government's policy toolbox grew to include centralized monetary management through the Bank of Canada and more formal mechanisms for crisis relief, a trend that would accelerate with subsequent decades. In addition to these financial institutions, social and labor movements pressed for protective measures and fairer economic arrangements, giving impetus to parties like the CCF and social credit and shaping debates about who pays for welfare and how benefits should be delivered. Institution building in this era also extended to governance itself. The relationship between federal and provincial authorities, especially in times of economic stress, invited careful negotiation about responsibilities and resources. The result was not a single, sweeping reform but a series of steps that strengthened the framework for social policy, pensions and welfare provisions, unemployment relief, and fiscal mechanisms designed to stabilize provincial economies. The 1930s thus marked a clear shift. Canada began to knit welfare considerations into the fabric of national policy, laying groundwork for a modern state that would assume a more deliberate role in citizens' daily lives. Rights, too, experienced a momentum shift. Expanding political participation among women and other groups contributed to a broader sense of citizenship. While full parity would come later, this era's advances helped normalize the idea that a nation's strength derives from the inclusion and protection of its diverse people. Institutions adapted to these shifts, incorporating public accountability and channels for citizen voice into the political process. The outcome was a more robust public sphere in which rights and welfare were recognized as shared responsibilities rather than gifts granted by episodic reform. Section 6.4, Global Tensions, Domestic Choices, and National Direction. Canada's interwar trajectory unfolded against a backdrop of global volatility. The rise of totalitarian regimes, shifting trade networks, and the lingering shadows of the First World War forced Canadians to think hard about allegiance, security, and their country's place in the international order. The Statute of Westminster, 1931, signaled an important step toward full sovereignty in foreign affairs, even as deep ties to Britain remained a practical reality for decades. In this period, Ottawa's leaders navigated a cautious path between imperial commitments and a practical, increasingly autonomous national policy. Domestically, the era was not simply about crisis management, it was about direction. The federal government's willingness to experiment with economic and social policy reflected a broader belief that national strength depended on resilient institutions and confident citizens. The growth of political organizations that challenged the traditional party system, most notably the CCF and social credit, indicated a public appetite for different models of how the economy should work and who should benefit. This tension between continuity and reform would propel Canada toward a more deliberate national project in the decades ahead. Canada's interwar period also culminated in choices that would shape its future conflict and recovery cycles. By the late 1930s, the nation confronted looming questions about defense, industrial capacity, and financial stability as global tensions intensified. The public conversation merged economic prudence with strategic foresight, how to protect citizens while sustaining growth, how to balance regional needs with national priorities, and how to translate a broader sense of Canadian identity into concrete, durable institutions. The interwar era thus prepared Canada to face the coming storm with a more resilient state, a more expressive culture, and a more participatory political life. In reflection, the interwar years mark a crucial hinge in Canadian history. Crisis did not erase old divisions, it sharpened them and, crucially, pushed the country to imagine a broader social compact. The era's policy experiments, cultural renewals, and institutional expansions created a framework in which a modern Canada could grow, cautiously but decisively, toward greater national autonomy, expanded public responsibility, and a more inclusive sense of citizenship. As readers follow these threads, they can see how a country shaped by both revolutions and reforms became more capable of meeting the needs of its diverse people in a changing world.
Chapter 7: The Quiet Transformation, Postwar Prosperity and Social Change. Sections. Section 7.1: Economic Growth and Industrial Shifts in a Global Context. Section 7.2: The Social Covenant, Welfare State and Public Expectations. Section 7.3: Immigration Waves and Cultural Reimagining. Section 7.4: Environment and Indigenous Rights in a Growing Consciousness. Introduction. The post-war era in Canada unfolded as a long, steady transformation rather than a single dramatic turning point. Prosperity spread beyond big wartime factories into everyday life, reshaping towns, suburbs, and family budgets. The country built new institutions and habits that would anchor social expectation, a safety net, accessible education, and a growing openness to newcomers. Readers will see how economic growth, state expansion, migration, and evolving rights together redefined what it meant to live in a Canada that was increasingly connected to the wider world. What follows is a narrative grounded in real experiences, platforms of growth, moments of contest, and everyday decisions by workers, policymakers, immigrants, and Indigenous communities. The chapters treat these changes as interconnected threads, shifts in industry, the emergence of shared public commitments, the reimagining of national identity through immigration, and a growing consciousness of environment and rights. The chapter aims to illuminate not just what happened, but how ordinary Canadians felt and responded as prosperity reconfigured life from coast to coast. Section 7.1: Economic Growth and Industrial Shifts in a Global Context. Canada's economy in the post-war decades grew through a blend of revival and renewal. Wartime priorities gave way to consumer demand, household savings, and a booming resource base, fueling growth in manufacturing, energy, and services. Across the country, factories retooled, mines and pulp mills operated at scale, and new sectors, such as automobile assembly in Ontario, joined traditional strengths in forestry and mining. The country's place in a wider North American economy mattered as a catalyst, not just a backdrop. Global currents reinforced domestic expansion. The United States post-war strength and institutional frameworks like Bretton Woods and early trade rules shaped Canada's trade and investment climate. Cross-border supply chains deepened, aided by policies that eased friction between Canadian and American producers. The era also witnessed new infrastructure that unlocked regional potential, such as the St. Lawrence Seaway, which linked the Great Lakes to global shipping and spurred economic activity along the inland corridors. These forces made Canada's growth less about isolated pockets and more about integrated regional economies. Economic progress was not evenly distributed, but its logic was clear. Higher productivity, rising wages, and greater capital investment created a broader middle class. Suburbanization and rising demand for housing, transportation, and consumer goods accompanied the shift toward a more service-oriented economy in cities. The result was a nationwide pattern of growth that fed into public budgets and, crucially, into a sense that the country could sustain generous social programs while staying internationally competitive. The economy in this period thus became both a driver of prosperity and a platform for social change. Section 7.2: The Social Covenant, Welfare State and Public Expectations. The expansion of the welfare state emerged gradually but decisively in the post-war years. Programs started as targeted measures and matured into a broader social contract that touched many Canadians' daily lives. Family allowances, unemployment insurance, and later more universal health and pension programs provided a framework in which security could be anticipated as a collectively shared responsibility. The state's growing role reflected both humanitarian ideals and a recognition that prosperity needed structure and protection for ordinary families. Public expectations shifted as programs expanded in scope and reach. Canadians began to see hospitals and doctors as a shared public good, with federal and provincial cooperation creating a more equitable system of access. The accessibility of education and health care became a standard by which citizens measured government performance, and political discourse increasingly framed policy choices in terms of social solidarity and long-term resilience. In this climate, taxation, public spending, and regional equity became everyday political conversations, shaping elections, party platforms, and policy experimentation across the country. Yet this transformation carried tensions as well as benefits. Policymakers faced questions about cost, efficiency, and the balance between universal access and targeted support. Regions with different economic profiles demanded tailored solutions, and debates about how far the state should go, versus how much individuals and communities should contribute, remained central. The enduring result was a social covenant that sought both security and opportunity, a delicate equilibrium that defined Canada's political culture for decades to come. Section 7.3, Immigration Waves and Cultural Reimagining. The post-war period brought sustained waves of immigration that reshaped Canada's demographic and cultural landscape. Early surges included displaced people and refugees from war-torn Europe, families seeking better futures, and workers attracted by new jobs in growing industries. These flows began to alter the social fabric by introducing diverse languages, cuisines, and traditions into communities that had long identified with a more homogeneous European ancestry base. Immigration thus became a central force in Canada's evolving national story. Policy shifts in the 1960s and early 1970s redefined how Canada approached newcomers. The 1967 immigration reforms introduced a points system that evaluated applicants on factors such as education, language, and skills rather than country of origin. This change opened doors to people from a wider array of regions and laid the groundwork for a more multicultural Canada. The official accommodations that followed, most notably the Official Languages Act of 1969 and the emergence of a formal multicultural policy in 1971, recognized that Canadian identity could embrace many cultures without erasing a shared civic space. Cities became laboratories of change as immigrant communities settled and thrived. Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver grew into vibrant hubs where multiple languages and traditions coexisted and blended. Schools, neighborhoods, and local businesses reflected this mosaic, while cultural festivals and multicultural organizations helped new Canadians find belonging. At the same time, existing social institutions learned to adapt to a more diverse population, reshaping education, housing, and community life in lasting ways. Section 7.4, Environment and Indigenous Rights. In a growing consciousness, environmental awareness began to enter public discourse in the 1960s and 1970s, as growth and industrial activity prompted questions about sustainability, pollution, and stewardship. Government departments expanded their roles, scientific research gained prominence, and regional initiatives addressed water quality, air, and land use. The emergence of a formal environmental policy culture, later embodied in stronger legislation and intergovernmental cooperation, reflected a broader shift in how Canadians understood their responsibility to future generations and to neighboring ecosystems like the Great Lakes. Indigenous rights rose to national prominence as communities asserted their treaty rights, land claims, and self-determination. The late 1960s saw the watershed moment of the White Paper proposal, which aimed to address Indigenous status within a framework of assimilation. Its reception sparked a robust Indigenous counter-narrative, the Red Paper, that argued for the recognition of treaty rights and distinct nations within Canada. These debates catalyzed a more attentive national conversation about sovereignty, governance, and the obligations of the state to Indigenous peoples. The decade's activism laid foundations for later negotiations, recognitions, and constitutional discussions that continued to shape Canadian politics. As environmental and Indigenous issues gained prominence, the sense that policy decisions should be sustainable and respectful of historic relationships grew stronger. The period saw early experiments in partnership, between federal and provincial authorities, and between communities and government, that would inform later governance. The combined attention to our environment and Indigenous rights marked a turning point. Prosperity did not erase responsibility, it reframed it in terms of long-term resilience and justice. Conclusion: reflection on a quiet yet deep change. The quiet transformation embodies a Canada that grew steadily into a more prosperous, inclusive, and reflective nation. Economic expansion created the resources and confidence for expansive social programs, while immigration reimagined what it means to belong in a single national story. A growing environmental consciousness and renewed attention to Indigenous rights revealed that prosperity without responsibility loses its meaning. Taken together, these threads show a nation that chose to invest in people, institutions, and future generations, an approach that continues to inform Canada's choices today. Chapter 8, Quebec and the National Question. Sections. Section 8.1, Language, Identity, and the Political Landscape. Section 8.2, Distinct Society. Federalism, Autonomy, and Power. Section 8.3, Referendums, Negotiations, and Reconfigurations. Section 8.4, Toward a More Inclusive Federation. The story of Quebec within Canada is a story about language, identity, and power, woven through institutions, streets, and everyday choices. It is a narrative of how a province redefines its place in a federation without surrendering its sense of self. This chapter traces the fault lines and conversations that have kept the national question alive from the Quiet Revolution to the present moment. It shows how voters, politicians, and citizens have shaped, negotiated, and reimagined Canada's constitutional fabric. Quebec's journey begins in the 1960s, when a rapid modernization of society sparked a rethinking of language, culture, and governance. The Quiet Revolution jolted old hierarchies and placed the state at the center of everyday life, from education to social welfare. French-language institutions and civil society rose to prominence as Quebec sought control over its own destiny. In this period, language and identity became practical questions, not merely symbols of pride. Section 8.1, Language, Identity, and the Political Landscape. The ascent of the French language in public life changed the rules of engagement for the province and the country. Bill 101, the Charter of the French language passed in 1977, made French the common language of business, education, and public life in Quebec. The law did not just regulate words, it redefined belonging, signaling that civic participation required language that could be used in courts, classrooms, and day-to-day commerce. The shift reverberated beyond Quebec's borders, shaping how Canadians imagined bilingualism and national unity. Identity in Quebec matured from a defensive posture to a confident assertion of culture and economy. French-language media, literature, and film expanded Quebec's cultural reach while fueling debates about who gets to define Quebec's future. This is not a simple tale of separatism, it is a story of a society asking who must be heard and who should govern. In classrooms and boardrooms alike, the question of language became a practical lens for evaluating power, fairness, and opportunity. The broader political landscape began to bend around these questions. Within federal politics, Quebec's shift toward sovereignty-leaning sentiment reshaped party strategies, legislative agendas, and regional alliances. The province's younger leaders argued that national policy could not ignore the reality of a francophone majority that deserved real influence. The result was a climate in which language rights and political autonomy moved from niche concerns to central issues on the national stage. Section 8.2, Distinct Society. Federalism, Autonomy, and Power. The idea of Quebec as a distinct society has circulated for decades as a way to explain why the province seeks special arrangements within Canada. In practice, distinct society has meant different things at different times: constitutional recognition, cultural autonomy, or jurisdictional flexibility in areas like education and culture. The concept has been both a rallying cry and a point of contention, depending on who was speaking and what was at stake. The Meech Lake Accord of 1987 attempted to enshrine Quebec's distinctiveness in the Constitution, but it failed to win enough support. Its collapse underscored how difficult it is to reach consensus on recognizing difference within a single national framework. The Charlottetown Accord of 1992 tried a broader reform, but it too fell short, illustrating the challenges of reconciling regional autonomy with a unified constitutional order. These episodes revealed that autonomy, without broad buy-in, can become a source of division rather than cohesion. Yet the conversation about asymmetrical federalism has endured. Quebec has long argued for more say in areas closely tied to its character and realities, such as language-related governance, education, and cultural policy. The 2006 acknowledgement by Parliament that Quebec is a nation within Canada offered symbolic recognition of its unique status while preserving the overall federal structure. The essential tension remains: how much power should Quebec shoulder, and how should that power be balanced with the rest of Canada? Section 8.3, Referendums, Negotiations, and Reconfigurations. Referendums in Quebec have acted like political weather vanes, revealing mood, testing strategies, and signaling the province's willingness to rethink its relationship with Ottawa. The 1980 referendum asked Quebec voters whether the province should pursue independence with a framework for political and economic association with Canada. The result reinforced the desire for reform and negotiation but kept Quebec within the Canadian fold for the moment. The vote did not produce a clean mandate for sovereignty, yet it emphasized that constitutional choices could no longer be postponed. The 1995 referendum brought the deepest challenge yet to Canada's constitutional settlement. The question of sovereignty came close to success, with the result a razor-thin margin in favor of staying part of Canada. The closeness of the vote left a lasting impression. The Canadian Federation would endure only if it could address Quebec's concerns in a credible and fair manner. In the years that followed, negotiations and institutional reforms attempted to bridge those divides, though a durable settlement remained elusive. The constitutional reforms that followed, chief among them the patriation of the Constitution in 1982 and the subsequent debates over amending formulas, shaped how Quebec could influence national governance. The Meech Lake and Charlottetown episodes highlighted the limits of consensus in a diverse federation, while the Clarity Act of 2000 established a procedural guardrail for any future referendum. Taken together, these moments show how referendums, negotiations, and reconfigurations continue to redefine the Federation's architecture. Section 8.4 Toward a more inclusive federation. A more inclusive federation recognizes Quebec as a full participant in Canada's future while honoring its unique character. This means strengthening intergovernmental collaboration, revisiting constitutional reform with broad consent, and expanding citizen engagement to ensure that policy reflects diverse experiences across provinces and communities. It also requires embracing the realities of a changing society, immigration, Indigenous rights, and the growing influence of urban and multilingual communities. Practically, inclusivity looks like intensified cooperation on shared challenges, climate policy that respects regional differences, economic development that leverages Quebec's strengths in technology and culture, and social policies that reflect Quebec's language identity while protecting minority rights across the country. It also means a constitutional tempo that rewards dialogue over disruption, with reform built on consensus rather than coercion. In this vision, the Federation adapts without dissolving, and Quebec remains an essential voice in shaping Canada's future. Conclusion: the national question in Quebec is not a problem to be solved once and for all, but a conversation to be lived with care and candor. The province's language, culture, and political choices continue to shape federal dynamics in every generation. By prioritizing inclusive governance, respectful dialogue, and shared responsibility, Canada can honor Quebec's identity while strengthening the Federation as a whole. The chapters ahead will carry this thread forward, exploring how new Canadians participate in an evolving national story that belongs to all Canadians, in every province and territory. Chapter 9: Global Ties and Domestic Transitions. Sections. Section 9.1: Canada in Global Markets, Economy, Trade, and Growth. Section 9.2: Rights, Democracy, and Public Policy. Section 9.3: Technology, Media, and the Public Sphere. Section 9.4: Diplomacy and Peacekeeping, Canada on the World Stage. Canada has long walked a fine line between neighborhood practicality and global ambition. This chapter traces how international currents have shaped Canadian life at home, and how domestic choices in rights, policy, and technology have, in turn, steered Canada onto the world stage. The story is not one of easy victories, but of steady recalibration, keeping faith with core values while adapting to a changing world. Through 4 sections, we explore economics, rights and policy, the digital public sphere, and diplomacy, all as interlocking pieces of a single national arc. Section 9.1: Canada in Global Markets, Economy, Trade, and Growth. Canada's economy has always leaned into global markets the way a canoe leans toward the river's current. Our abundance of resources, energy, minerals, forests, and agricultural products, meets the demand of distant buyers, forging a trading system that binds communities from coast to partners around the world. The United States remains Canada's closest economic neighbor, with a long history of integrated supply chains that connect factories, farms, and ports across the border. Yet the story is not one of dependence alone. Canada has diversified its links through agreements that opened Europe, Asia, and beyond to Canadian goods and ideas. Trade deals have been multipliers, not merely documents. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, CETA, provisionally in force since 2017, opened new markets for Canadian producers and investors, especially in advanced manufacturing and agri-food. The CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, offered pathways to Pacific markets, while the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, USMCA, known in Canada as CUSMA, retooled the North American economic architecture after NAFTA. These pacts helped Canadian firms upgrade productivity, diversify risk, and participate more fully in global value chains. The mix of sectors underpins resilience and tension alike. Resource sectors, oil and gas, mining, forestry, continue to anchor exports, even as global demand and climate policy push for cleaner, more efficient production. Meanwhile, Canada's technology and services sectors, fintech, digital media, health sciences, clean tech, are growing faster than many traditional industries, promising new jobs and regional hubs. Global markets create opportunities, but they also demand adaptation, investment in infrastructure, workforce skills, and innovation, attention to currency and energy transitions, and a steady hand in diplomacy to keep trade flowing smoothly. As Canada looks outward, it remains mindful of internal strengths and vulnerabilities. Global markets reward openness and competitiveness, but they also test social cohesion, environmental stewardship, and the capacity to manage booms and busts. The next sections examine how Canada translates those external pressures into domestic rights, policies, and public discourse that sustain growth without sacrificing core values. Section 9.2, Rights, Democracy, and Public Policy. Canada's political life rests on a conviction that liberty and equality are not tokens but responsibilities shared by every citizen. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, entrenched in 1982, acts as a constitutional compass that guides lawmaking, policing, and public life. It protects civil liberties, gender equality, and the right to a fair process, while anchoring Canada's identity as a society that values diversity and inclusion. The Constitution's living framework invites ongoing interpretation and renews the conversation about what freedom means in changing times. A defining dimension of Canadian democracy is its relationship with Indigenous peoples. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work spotlighted the harms of past policies and set out calls to action aimed at healing and reconciliation. While progress has been uneven, these challenges have reframed national policy, pushing education, language rights, and land acknowledgements into everyday practice. Policymakers increasingly recognize that true democracy is inseparable from recognizing rights to self-determination, shared decision-making, and respect for sovereignty. Public policy in Canada often blends universal principles with pragmatic programs. Universal health care, social safety nets, and accessible education are foundational commitments that support participation in a global economy. Immigration policy, including pathways for skilled workers and humanitarian entrants, reflects Canada's identity as a welcoming, policy-driven nation where inclusion strengthens democracy. In the digital age, rights extend into privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity, where laws such as privacy statutes and evolving guidelines strive to balance innovation with individual autonomy. The tension between individual rights and collective responsibilities is a constant feature of policy debates. Climate action, affordable housing, and social supports require cross-partisan cooperation and clear accountability. Across these debates, Canada's approach aims to protect freedoms while building the institutions that enable everyone to participate, whether in a town hall, a classroom, or a digital platform. The outcome is a democracy that aspires to be both principled and practical, capable of learning from its mistakes and adjusting course when necessary. Section 9.3, Technology, Media, and the Public Sphere. The digital era has transformed how Canadians think, work, and argue with one another. Technology has unlocked new workloads, connected dispersed communities, and created vast stores of data that power both business and governance. The public sphere has shifted from town square conversations to online debates, where ideas move quickly but so do misperceptions and misinformation. Canada's challenge is to nurture a robust, reliable information ecosystem while embracing the efficiencies and innovations that technology offers. Media in Canada sits at the intersection of public service and private enterprise. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC/Radio Canada, remains a central pillar of national storytelling, while private outlets, digital platforms, and social networks broaden the reach of news and culture. Regulatory bodies such as the CRTC supervise content and competition, seeking a balance between local voices, Canadian culture, and global access. Policy tools, content rules, funding programs, and licensing frameworks aim to sustain a diverse and independent media landscape in a crowded online space. Canada's technology policy has grown from a mosaic of provincial strengths and federal ambition into a coordinated national project. The Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, shapes how businesses handle data, while newer digital policies address privacy, security, and cross-border data flows. The country has fostered technology hubs, from the Toronto-Waterloo region to Vancouver and Montreal, where startups meet established firms and research institutions. A broader, digital charter mindset emphasizes open data, public innovation, and education that keeps Canadians competitive in a rapidly evolving economy. Challenges linger as the public and private sectors wrestle with the pace of change. Ensuring equitable access to high-speed internet, guarding against privacy breaches, and sustaining credible journalism in the age of online platforms require ongoing collaboration among government, industry, and communities. The strength of Canada's approach lies in its willingness to experiment with policy while maintaining a commitment to transparency, accountability, and public trust. In this landscape, technology serves both as engine of growth and a test of democratic resilience. Section 9.4, Diplomacy and Peacekeeping, Canada on the World Stage. Canada's international vocation has public and moral dimensions. It is a nation of neighbors who also stand up for global standards of peace, human rights, and human security. From early peacekeeping efforts to sustained participation in complex missions, Canada's diplomacy has long prioritized multilateral cooperation and quiet leadership. The country's approach blends voluntary military and civilian contributions with diplomacy, aid, and development work that build partnerships and reinforce norms the world tends to rely on. Peacekeeping has been a central thread in Canada's foreign policy narrative. Canadian forces have served in missions across Cyprus, Haiti, Bosnia, and Africa, often in concert with United Nations and allied partners. These deployments have required patient negotiation, local engagement, and a willingness to operate in challenging environments. Alongside soldiers, Canadian diplomats, development experts, and peacebuilders have worked to stabilize communities, train local institutions, and promote respect for human rights. In recent decades, Canada has broadened its diplomatic toolkit. Multilateral engagement, participation in NATO, the G7/G20, and UN reform discussions, has remained a constant, while trade diplomacy, development assistance, and climate diplomacy have grown in importance. Canada's foreign policy emphasizes soft power, education exchanges, cultural diplomacy, and global health initiatives that create long-term goodwill. The country also embraces a pragmatic realism, recognizing limits and choosing coalitions where consensus is possible and principled action is required. Reflection on these dynamics reveals a country that negotiates global ties with humility and resolve. Canada's domestic innovations, protecting rights, expanding public services, and investing in technology, amplify its capacity to shape international conversations. In a world of interconnected risks and opportunities, Canada's path is not to retreat into sanctuary but to remain an active, values-based participant in the chorus of nations. Chapter 10, Diversity as Strength, the Multicultural Shift. Sections. Section 10.1, New Canadians, Migration, Settlement, and Community Building. Section 10.2, Civic Life and Inclusion, Policy, Practice, and People's Realities. Section 10.3, Language, Identity, and Schools of Belonging. Section 10.4, Local to National, the Mosaic in Everyday Life. Diversity in Canada is not a recent trend but a defining condition of the nation. This chapter looks at how migration, policy, schooling, and everyday life have reframed what it means to belong. We begin with the arrival of new Canadians and the communities they build, then move through the systems that shape inclusion, the language and identity questions that schools navigate, and finally how local experiences ripple into national culture. The through line is simple: diversity is not a backdrop but a force that molds Canadian life, economy, and imagination. Section 10.1, New Canadians, Migration, Settlement, and Community Building. New Canadians arrive with hopes for safety, opportunity, and a future they can shape. They come in waves, between borders and continents, carrying languages, foods, and customs that gradually become part of the national fabric. Settlement is not a single moment but a process of finding work, building networks, and learning the rhythms of a new country. In cities and towns across the country, newcomers create vibrant communities that offer mutual aid, language support, and spaces to nurture identity. These efforts, formal settlement services, faith-based networks, and local clubs, turn first encounters into lasting belonging. There are stories behind the statistics: a family who opens a small bakery in a bustling immigrant corridor, a community center that hosts language circles and children's programs, a group that preserves a hometown tradition with a Canadian twist. In neighborhoods like these, newcomers and longtime residents share street corners, schools, and small businesses, weaving together a mosaic of everyday life. Ethnic and faith organizations serve as springboards for integration while keeping cultural roots alive. The result is not a melting pot but a tapestry in which old and new colors strengthen one another. Section 10.2, Civic Life and Inclusion, Policy, Practice, and People's Realities. Canada's civic landscape is shaped by commitments that aim to balance opportunity with fairness. The late 20th century brought a formal embrace of diversity through foundational policies, multiculturalism as a guiding principle, formal recognition of 2 official languages, and laws that prohibit discrimination. The multicultural policy, first articulated in the 1970s and later reinforced by the Canadian Multiculturalism Act, treats Canada as a space where many cultures can flourish together. The Official Languages Act safeguards English and French as pillars of national life, from government services to public education. Anti-discrimination laws, employment equity measures, and refugee sponsorship programs connect policy to practice, translating ideals into everyday rights. Yet policy alone does not capture the lived realities of newcomers. Municipal programs, settlement agencies, and community groups translate national commitments into local access, helping newcomers navigate housing, health care, and job markets. The private sponsorship of refugees program, for example, demonstrates how civic generosity can accelerate integration by mobilizing community networks to welcome and support new residents. In classrooms, workplaces, and town halls, inclusion work takes shape as everyday practice: interpreters in medical clinics, multilingual job postings, and inclusive hiring panels. Across provinces and territories, people push beyond compliance to build genuinely welcoming environments where differences become resources rather than obstacles. Section 10.3, Language, Identity, and Schools of Belonging. Language is both the bridge to opportunity and a thread weaving personal identity into daily life. Canada's bilingual framework recognizes that language shapes access to education, employment, and civic participation, while also affirming the right to preserve mother tongues. In classrooms, bilingual and immersion programs open doors to higher achievement and cross-cultural understanding, while heritage language classes help students stay connected to home cultures. Schools become spaces where diverse identities can be validated, where curricula honor multiple perspectives, and where students learn to navigate a shared public sphere without surrendering their roots. The goal is not to replace languages but to enable all languages to coexist and enrich learning. Identity in a multicultural context often unfolds through everyday encounters inside and outside schools. A student who speaks a home language at the kitchen table can study the language of schooling in the same house while practicing a second language with new friends at school. Teachers and administrators increasingly seek curricula that reflect varied histories and contributions, from Indigenous perspectives to the experiences of newcomers, so students recognize themselves in the stories they study and in the people around them. This approach has tangible benefits: higher engagement, stronger academic resilience, and a sense of belonging that extends beyond the classroom into neighborhoods and workplaces. Language thus becomes a living practice of belonging, not merely a subject to be studied. Section 10.4, Local to National, the Mosaic in Everyday Life. The everyday life of Canadian communities, markets, places of worship, sports clubs, and cultural festivals embodies the country's mosaic in action. Immigrant-owned businesses, multilingual signage, and neighborhood associations reveal a society that learns by daily interaction. Cultural celebrations, Diwali parades, Chinese New Year fairs, Caribbean street markets, and Indigenous arts create shared calendars that remind Canadians of their common humanity while honoring distinct histories. In workplaces, multilingual teams, flexible work arrangements, and inclusive leadership models reflect a country where different ways of knowing inform decision-making and creativity. The mosaic is not a static image; it grows and adapts as people migrate, move between regions, and bring new ideas into public life. Cities often illustrate the diffusion of culture from local to national scales. A neighborhood greengrocer's shelves tell stories of global trade, a church, mosque, or temple offers language circles, food drives, and youth programs that connect families across generations. Public institutions, libraries, schools, and city councils become laboratories for inclusion as they respond to the needs of an increasingly diverse population. National conversations about immigration, refugee policy, and social cohesion are frequently sparked by local experiences, proving that democracy works best when it listens to the everyday voices of its newest citizens. Conclusion: the power of diversity as a Canadian advantage. Diversity has moved from being a footnote of Canadian life to its central rhythm. The chapter's through line, migration shaping communities, policy guiding practice, language shaping belonging, and everyday life embodying the mosaic, demonstrates that strength emerges from organized generosity, shared responsibilities, and the patient work of building trust. When newcomers are welcomed as full participants in civic life, they bring energy, entrepreneurship, and new viewpoints that propel societies forward. If readers take away one idea, let it be this: diversity is not merely tolerated, it is the engine of Canada's ongoing renewal, inviting every generation to reimagine what it means to belong. Chapter 11: Environment, Resources, and a Changing Climate. Sections. Section 11.1: The Land as Economy and Home, Resource Politics in Canada. Section 11.2: Indigenous Stewardship and Resource Conflicts. Section 11.3: Conservation, Climate Action, and Policy Shifts. Section 11.4: Canada in a Global Ecology, Commitments, Challenges, Opportunities. Introduction. Canada's story is written in its land as much as in its people. From the boreal forest to the Arctic coast, from prairie plains to coastal cities, the environment has shaped livelihoods, politics, and identity. This chapter traces how Canadians have treated the land as both home and engine, how resource wealth has driven growth, how Indigenous stewardship has shaped but sometimes clashed with development, and how climate change is forcing a new balance between exploitation, conservation, and responsibility to future generations. Read as a single arc, the chapters of environment, resources, and climate reveal a nation continually negotiating with its own footprint on a living world. 11.1: The Land as Economy and Home, Resource Politics in Canada. Canada's economy has long depended on the land, and the land answers in turn with complexity. Resource politics here means negotiating provincial authority, federal interests, Indigenous rights, corporate markets, and community well-being. The result is a patchwork of policies that try to balance jobs with long-term health of ecosystems, now under pressure from a warming climate and shifting global demand. The land is both workplace and home, and those two roles sometimes pull in opposite directions. Take oil, forests, minerals, and fresh water as emblematic pillars. The oil sands of Alberta sit at the edge of modern industry, a source of wealth and a symbol of energy security, but also a point of controversy over environmental cost and Indigenous rights. In British Columbia, forests and fisheries have driven communities for generations, while modern forestry must reckon with habitat protection and the rights of harvesting nations. The mining belts of Ontario and Saskatchewan have shaped towns and infrastructure, yet extraction raises questions about tailings, water quality, and long-term land use. Water resources across the prairies and the Mackenzie region illustrate the dual identity of water as resource and life support, demanding careful governance as climate variability intensifies droughts and floods. Policy here is a constant negotiation. Provinces retain ownership of many natural resources, while the federal government shapes national standards and cross-border trade. Revenue from resource sectors funds public services, infrastructure, and often rapid economic cycles, but the benefits are uneven. Ripple effects touch communities differently and can pit regional priorities against one another. The rise of environmental concerns has pushed policy towards smarter planning, impact assessments, and increasingly, recognition that resource development must fit within a changing climate, not merely against it. The challenge is to foster resilient communities and sustainable landscapes without sacrificing the employment and economic vitality that many Canadians rely on. 11.2: Indigenous Stewardship and Resource Conflicts. Indigenous nations have stewarded these landscapes for millennia, bringing sophisticated knowledge about ecological balance and long-term thinking to resource decisions. The modern Canadian framework recognizes Indigenous rights and title in law, treaties, and court decisions, while still pressing to align development with the aspirations of diverse communities. Co-management and impact agreements have become common tools for weaving traditional stewardship into contemporary projects, though the work remains ongoing and contested in many places. The conversation about land use increasingly centers on consent, partnership, and meaningful benefits for Indigenous communities. Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia offers a landmark example of collaboration. In the 2000s, a coalition of Indigenous nations, provincial authorities, and media attention helped forge a durable plan to conserve vast forest areas while allowing sustainable logging and local employment under strict protections. This agreement showed what is possible when traditional knowledge guides modern policy, and when communities maintain a clear say in how their lands are used. At the same time, broader movements, such as Idle No More in 2012, pushed national attention to Indigenous rights and governance, reminding the public that resource decisions cannot be separated from questions of sovereignty and cultural continuity. In practice, Indigenous stewardship today often takes the form of guardians programs, negotiates Indigenous-led impact and benefit agreements, and seeks to reconcile development with cultural and ecological values. Coastal nations and inland communities alike press for co-decision frameworks, transparent consultation, and mechanisms to share risks and rewards. Yet conflicts persist, from pipeline routes to mineral exploration to hydro projects, illustrating that stewardship is not a finished map but a continuous negotiation. The path forward hinges on recognizing rights, honoring treaties, and building institutions that respect both ancient knowledge and contemporary science. 11.3 Conservation, Climate Action, and Policy Shifts. Conservation and climate action have moved from niche concerns to central national policy in Canada. The country now stitches together protection of habitats, emission reduction targets, and adaptation strategies into a single, evolving agenda. The shift reflects a growing understanding that resource wealth and ecological health must grow together, not in isolation. Nature-based solutions, protecting wetlands, restoring forests, and maintaining healthy landscapes, are seen as complementary to technological and regulatory approaches. Policy instruments have evolved in response to science and international commitments. A federal carbon price and related standards began to take hold in the late 2010s, with a framework designed to apply where provincial measures did not exist or were weaker. The aim is to shift energy choices, industrial processes, and transportation toward lower emissions while protecting households from volatility. In parallel, Canada has pursued stronger conservation targets and expanded protected areas, a move reinforced by global biodiversity discussions and national security concerns about ecological resilience. The country also invests in climate adaptation, strengthening infrastructure against severe weather, supporting northern communities facing thawing permafrost, and fostering resilient food and water systems. Policy shifts have not been without friction. Balancing short-term economic gains with long-term environmental health requires careful sequencing and credible transition plans for workers and communities tied to resource industries. The federal government, provinces, Indigenous nations, and industry must collaborate to align climate ambition with regional realities, all while maintaining public trust in science, governance, and fairness. The climate challenge also reframes federal-provincial relations, nudging discussions toward shared targets, transparent reporting, and credible accountability mechanisms that can withstand political and economic shifts. 11.4 Canada in a global ecology, commitments, challenges, opportunities. Canada's climate and ecological agenda sits within a global frame of climate diplomacy, trade, and shared responsibility for the planet's health. The country's wealth of natural resources and its diversified economy create both leverage and vulnerability in international negotiations. Canada participates in global commitments to reduce emissions, protect biodiversity, and support climate resilience in developing nations, while also promoting clean tech innovation and sustainable energy export opportunities. The result is a delicate balance between keeping markets open and strengthening Canada's role as a steward of the environment. Internationally, Canada has aligned with major climate frameworks and biodiversity targets, including participation in global climate accords and biodiversity initiatives. The nation has outlined ambitious goals for protecting natural spaces, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and accelerating the transition to clean energy industries. Northern and Arctic governance, where climate change is most acutely felt, places Canada at the forefront of search and rescue, scientific research, and international cooperation on icy frontiers and Indigenous rights in the Arctic sphere. Yet challenges persist: dependence on fossil fuels for economic stability, geopolitical shifts in energy demand, and the need to fund rapid decarbonization while sustaining communities that still rely on resource industries for livelihoods. These tensions create opportunities as well: growth in renewable energy production, green infrastructure, and pioneering conservation finance can turn climate action into economic renewal. Canada's global ecology is also an invitation to learn from Indigenous knowledge. Traditional practices, when respectfully integrated with modern science, offer pathways to more resilient ecosystems and more truthful governance. The country's best future lies in aligning national interests with planetary health, drawing strength from regional diversity, and embracing collaboration across borders, sectors, and cultures. In the end, Canada's climate journey is not only about emissions targets, it is about shaping a humane, sustainable way of living on a changing planet. Conclusion: a reflective moment. The chapters on environment, resources, and climate reveal a country constantly negotiating between growth and stewardship, between local needs and global responsibilities, between the certainty of today and the uncertainties of tomorrow. The Canadian story is one of adaptation, learning from Indigenous wisdom, listening to scientists, and creating institutions that can respond to a warming world. If readers take away one message, it is this: sustainable progress requires honest reflection, collaborative governance, and the courage to reimagine what prosperity means in a climate-constrained era. Chapter 12: Technology, Innovation, and the Everyday. Sections. Section 12.1: The Digital Age Arrives, Communication, Information, Access. Section 12.2: Innovation Hubs, Universities, and Regional Growth. Section 12.3: Work, Education, and the Changing Day-to-Day. Section 12.4: The Digital Public Sphere, Trust, News, and Engagement. Canada is a country defined as much by its people as by its landscapes. In this chapter, we follow how digital technology wove itself into daily life across a vast federation, from bustling city neighborhoods to quiet rural towns. The narrative traces not only gadgets and networks but the institutions, policies, and human habits that turned a sweeping digital promise into everyday reality. The story is still unfolding, but the chapters that follow reveal how the digital age reshaped work, learning, communication, and public life in Canada. The digital era did not arrive in one moment but through many converging currents. It began with the ordinary tools people already used: phones, letters, classrooms, libraries, being reimagined by new networks, data, and software. As this chapter moves through its 4 sections, you'll see how innovation hubs and universities sparked regional growth, how work and education shifted from fixed routines to flexible, technology-enabled practices, and how the digital public sphere redefined trust, information, and participation in civic life. The through line is practical: technology shapes choices, and those choices in turn shape technology. Section 12.1: The Digital Age Arrives, Communication, Information, Access. In late 20th century Canada, everyday life began to tilt from analog to digital. The telephone and the first email accounts opened private conversations to reach beyond the immediate neighbors, while the early web invited strangers to share knowledge across provinces and oceans. With each new connection, the pace of information changed, from the slow rhythm of letters to the instantaneous cadence of messages and online pages. The magic lay less in the novelty of machines and more in the new pathways they opened for daily life. Yet access did not arrive evenly. Urban households often found faster connections and broader choices, while rural communities faced slower speeds and limited options. Governments and regulators responded with broadband initiatives, digital literacy programs, and efforts to keep public services accessible online. Libraries, schools, and community centers emerged as trusted gateways to the digital world, offering training, devices, and guidance for people navigating new tools. These foundations built the stage for Canadians to participate more fully in a rapidly connected society. As information moved online, the nature of public life began to shift. Public libraries, universities, and government portals became portals to knowledge as well as services, expanding who could learn and how. The shift also raised questions about privacy, security, and the reliability of online information. The digital age, then, was not just about devices, it was about ensuring that access, trust, and literacy kept pace with rapid change. This sets the stage for the growth of innovation ecosystems across the country in the next section. Section 12.2: Innovation Hubs, Universities, and Regional Growth. Canada's universities and research parks emerged as engines of regional development and social renewal. In Waterloo Region, a dense axiom took root: students and researchers could spin ideas into companies, and companies could feed back into classrooms and campuses. This loop gave rise to a workforce skilled in software, sensors, and advanced manufacturing, while also attracting global investors and entrepreneurs. The result was a resilient regional economy that could pivot with new technologies. Montreal's AI ecosystem, anchored by institutions like Mila, showed how curiosity about intelligence could translate into real-world impact. Pair that with Toronto's broad tech and startup culture and you have a spectrum of innovation that stretches across the country. Ottawa's Ottawa-Gatineau corridor and Vancouver's digital media and software sectors illustrate Canada's distributed knowledge economy, where hubs aren't confined to a single city but are woven into multiple regional ecosystems. Canada's policy environment, funding for research, incubators, and public-private partnerships helped knit these clusters together with universities, small firms, and global firms seeking talent and ideas. Some emblematic outcomes speak to the everyday. Shopify's Ottawa origins highlight how a campus idea can become a global platform for commerce. In Montreal, AI labs, startups, and cross-disciplinary collaborations turned theoretical breakthroughs into applications for industry and public life. Across the country, universities and industry partners created spaces where students could transition from learners to problem solvers, designers, and builders. The broad pattern is clear: innovation thrives where universities connect with industry, government supports risk-taking, and communities invest in talent and infrastructure. Section 12.2 also invites attention to regional differences and opportunities. Innovating communities became magnets for skilled workers, startups, and families seeking a balanced life in vibrant places that value knowledge and collaboration. Yet the same uneven geography that created gaps in internet access also highlighted the importance of inclusive growth, ensuring rural and remote regions could participate in the benefits of innovation. When innovation expands outward from major cities to smaller communities, it reshapes the daily lives of teachers, technicians, nurses, and small business owners who are now connected to global networks and markets. Section 12.3, Work, Education, and the Changing Day-to-Day. Workplaces shifted from rigid, location-bound arrangements to flexible, technology-enabled environments. Cloud-based collaboration, project management tools, and real-time communication allowed teams to work across cities and time zones as easily as across desks. This transformation did not erase the value of face-to-face interaction, but it did redefine how work is organized, measured, and experienced. The day-to-day is now a rhythm of asynchronous planning, synchronous meetings, and on-demand problem-solving. Education followed a parallel arc. Classrooms each day blend traditional instruction with digital platforms that store resources, track progress, and enable remote participation. Students can access lectures from distant campuses, submit assignments online, and collaborate in real time with classmates across provinces. The COVID era accelerated a lasting shift toward hybrid learning, prompting investments in digital literacy and inclusive tools that support diverse learners. The result is a more personalized and accessible educational experience, even as it requires new habits and higher levels of self-direction. The daily life of Canadians also reflects a broader digital economy. Online banking, e-commerce, and digital health tools have become routine, while new jobs and sectors, data analysis, cybersecurity, app development, line up alongside traditional roles. At work and at home, technology has become a partner in planning, problem-solving, and information retrieval. Yet this transformation brings challenges, ensuring reliable access for all communities, protecting privacy, and supporting workers as roles evolve. The overarching question remains: how can education systems, employers, and policymakers nurture a workforce that thrives in a digital era without leaving anyone behind? Section 12.4, The Digital Public Sphere, Trust, News, and Engagement. The digital public sphere reimagined how Canadians learn, discuss, and decide together. News travels faster and farther than ever, with public broadcasters like the national and regional outlets joining digital platforms to reach audiences where they are. The online realm expanded the reach of civic conversation, enabling local organizers to mobilize volunteers, share resources, and solicit input from diverse communities. Yet the same space also amplifies misinformation, sensationalism, and the fragmentation of attention. Trust in information, once mediated primarily by established institutions, now depends on a mix of creators, platforms, and community norms. Journalists and editors face new pressures to verify quickly, disclose sources, and explain complex topics in accessible language. Canadians increasingly rely on media literacy to navigate a crowded information landscape, learning to question sources, cross-check claims, and recognize bias. Public institutions continue to play a critical role in curating quality information while safeguarding the principles of openness and accountability. Privacy and platform responsibility emerged as central themes in Canada's digital policy conversations. Privacy laws such as PIPEDA, alongside ongoing work on broader digital governance and the Digital Charter framework, shape how data is collected, stored, and used. The digital public square also invites citizens to participate more directly in governance, through online consultations, e-petitions, and virtual town halls, creating opportunities for more inclusive civic engagement. The balance now sought is between open access and responsible stewardship, ensuring that the public sphere remains trustworthy, diverse, and resilient. Conclusion: the everyday life of Canadians is now interwoven with digital tools, networks, and ideas. This chapter has traced how communication, learning, work, and public life have become more interconnected and more complex, presenting both opportunities and responsibilities. The technologies that connect a small Indigenous community in the north, a university lab in Quebec, and a startup in British Columbia are the same tools shaping the daily choices of every reader. As Canada continues to innovate, the challenge remains to ensure that access is universal, education is ongoing, trust is earned, and participation is meaningful for all. Chapter 13: Public Life, Media, and Democracy. Sections. Section 13.1: Institutions Alive, Elections, Governance, and Accountability. Section 13.2: Media Literacy, Public Debate, and Civic Courage. Section 13.3: Civil Rights Movements and Social Justice. Section 13.4: Resilience and Reform, Balancing Freedom, Equality, and Security. Public life in Canada is a living conversation among voters, elected representatives, courts, journalists, and countless everyday citizens who choose to take part. Democracy here unfolds in the rhythm of elections, the scrutiny of governance, and the daily work of civil society to expand rights and deepen accountability. This chapter threads four through lines: how institutions operate and respond to citizen input, how media literacy shapes public debate, how movements push for social justice, and how Canada seeks to balance freedom, equality, and security. Read together, they reveal democracy as ongoing practice rather than a fixed destination. Section 13.1: Institutions Alive, Elections, Governance, and Accountability. Elections set the tempo of democracy, opening a space where citizens choose who will lead and how power will be exercised. In Canada, elections are run by an independent body to protect fairness and credibility, while constitutional conventions and federal, provincial, municipal structures determine who is accountable to whom. The outcome is not a single moment but a continuing cycle of campaigns, votes, and post-election review that keeps government responsive to changing public needs. Governance in a federal system means many actors and layers: federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal, working within laws, budgets, and timelines that shape everyday life. Accountability emerges through a mix of institutions: parliamentary committees that scrutinize policy, the Auditor General's audits, and independent offices that safeguard rights and information. Transparency is reinforced by laws that grant public access to records, and by journalists, watchdog groups, and informed citizens who demand clarity. Taken together, these mechanisms turn governance from a closed process into a public conversation with consequences. The strength of public life rests on citizen participation beyond elections. Civic education, accessible data, open debates, and robust oversight all contribute to a polity where leaders are reminded that power is granted by people and can be described, questioned, and revised. In practice, accountability is most evident when policies are adjusted in response to evidence, critique, and the lived experiences of communities across the country. A healthy system invites scrutiny, values learning, and treats accountability as a shared obligation. Section 13.2: Media Literacy, Public Debate, and Civic Courage. Media shapes how Canadians understand events, frame debates, and hold power to account. The media landscape encompasses national broadcasters, regional outlets, and a flourishing array of digital platforms, each with different strengths, biases, and limits. In an era of rapid information flow, readers must cultivate media literacy, evaluating sources, cross-checking claims, and distinguishing opinion from verifiable fact. When audiences engage thoughtfully, media becomes a tool for informed decision-making rather than a stimulant for fear or misinformation. Public debate thrives when journalism operates with independence, accuracy, and courage. Investigative reporting shines a light on mismanagement or wrongdoing and creates a space where politicians and institutions are asked to justify their actions. The best reporting doesn't merely provoke outrage, it clarifies choices and expands public understanding. Real-world examples, whether a high-profile inquiry into political financing, coverage that reveals improper conduct, or the day-to-day work of regional editors, show how thoughtful news work supports a more accountable democracy. Courage in this arena also comes from citizens who challenge misleading narratives, demand evidence, and participate in constructive dialogue, even when the stakes feel personal or polarizing. Media literacy also means recognizing the dual edges of information networks. Social platforms can mobilize communities, but they can also spread rumors or simplify complex issues. Citizens, educators, and institutions must teach and practice critical inquiry, encourage credible sources, and celebrate journalism that explains rather than sensationalizes. In Canada, this culture of scrutiny strengthens public discourse by insisting on accuracy, fairness, and the willingness to revise conclusions in light of new information. Section 13.3, Civil Rights Movements and Social Justice. Canada's story of democracy is inseparable from the expansion of rights and the battles to make them real for all people. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, entrenched in 1982, provides a constitutional framework that protects civil liberties while inviting reflection on how those liberties apply in changing times. Yet rights were not declared fully formed in a single moment, they emerged through persistent advocacy, court decisions, and policy shifts that acknowledged previously marginalized voices. Key movements and milestones illuminate this process. Women's suffrage arrived in stages, with federal votes expanding in the early 20th century and provincial advances overlapping with national change, while Indigenous voting rights were clarified and broadened in subsequent decades. The decriminalization of homosexuality in 1969 and the nationwide legalization of same-sex marriage in 2005 marked major steps toward equality for LGBTQ+ Canadians. The late 20th and early 21st centuries also brought renewed attention to Indigenous rights, language protections, and cultural sovereignty, culminating in initiatives and commissions that seek truth, reconciliation, and meaningful action, such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action in 2015. Civil rights activism in Canada has often blended legal strategy with grassroots organizing. The result is a more inclusive public life, where marginalized communities articulate their experiences, contest discriminatory practices, and insist on policy responses that reflect diverse needs. These efforts remind us that democracy flourishes when all communities have equitable access to political processes, legal protections, and opportunities to contribute to public life. The ongoing work, addressing gaps, honoring treaties and responsibilities, and empowering new generations of advocates, keeps social justice at the center of national conversation. Section 13.4, Resilience and Reform, Balancing Freedom, Equality, and Security. The Canadian Charter framework guarantees fundamental freedoms while inviting ongoing assessment of how safety and rights coexist. Courts, legislatures, and independent bodies interpret and adapt these rights as technologies, threats, and social norms evolve. This dynamic tension, between protecting citizens and preserving civil liberties, has shaped dramatic moments in history, such as the shift from the War Measures Act era to a more rights-conscious approach and, more recently, to the refined use of emergency powers under the Emergencies Act. A resilient democracy requires continual reform and thoughtful calibration. Policy debates about privacy, surveillance, border security, and data protection illustrate the challenge of balancing individual rights with collective needs. Oversight by independent commissioners, transparent reporting, and vigorous public scrutiny help ensure that security measures do not erode the very freedoms they aim to protect. The result is a governance culture that learns from past mistakes, welcomes reform when evidence demands it, and invites broad participation in shaping a safer yet freer society. In practice, Canada's approach to resilience blends constitutional safeguards with democratic habits, open debate, frequent elections, judicial review, and a robust civil society that challenges official narratives. This ongoing process, that values equality, defends personal liberties, and responsibly manages risks, defines public life as a continuous conversation rather than a fixed set of rules. When citizens, institutions, and media collaborate with prudence and courage, democracy remains adaptable, inclusive, and enduring. Conclusion: a reflective synthesis. Canada's public life rests on four interwoven pillars: accountable institutions, an informed and courageous media ecosystem, an expansive and evolving rights landscape, and a persistent commitment to reform that respects freedom while addressing new threats. The chapter's threads converge to show democracy not as a final state but as an ongoing, collective practice, one that relies on informed citizens, robust public discourse, and institutions willing to listen, learn, and adjust. As race, faith, language, and identity illuminate the national conversation, Canada's democracy grows stronger when every voice has a seat at the table and every debate moves society toward greater justice and shared purpose. Chapter 14, Reconciliation, Rights, and a Shared Future. Sections. Section 14.1, Truth, Reconciliation, and Reframing History. Section 14.2, Indigenous Sovereignty, Treaties, and Pathways Forward. Section 14.3, Gender, Sexuality, and Civil Rights Across the Nation. Section 14.4, A Shared Future, Policy, Practice, and Everyday Hope. Introduction. Canada's story is inseparable from the histories and futures of its Indigenous nations. This chapter invites readers to move beyond silence and slogans toward a more honest, living understanding of reconciliation. Reconciliation is not a single moment but a practice, one that asks us to listen, learn, and take responsibility for how our choices shape the lives of others. Across the country, communities are testing what it means to translate memory into justice, language into policy, and rights into daily life. 14.1 Truth, Reconciliation, and Reframing History. Truth-telling began as a national conversation after decades of marginalization and denial. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, documented the lasting harms of the residential school system and offered 94 calls to action to guide transformative change. These calls address education, justice, child welfare, healthcare, and the preservation of cultures and languages. The aim is not to assign blame alone but to build a shared framework for accountability and repair. The recent uncoverings of unmarked graves, such as the 215 identified at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in 2021, underscored how hard inconvenient truths can be, and how urgent it is to listen to survivors and their communities. Reframing history means inviting Indigenous perspectives into classrooms, museums, and national narratives without silencing or erasing other voices. It requires careful, ongoing collaboration with elders, knowledge keepers, and youth to ensure that stories are accurate, contextual, and respectful. This reframing also means recognizing that Indigenous histories are living traditions, not relics of the past, and that they inform what a just society looks like today. When students read about Canada, they should encounter the ways Indigenous peoples shaped the land, governed themselves, and contributed to the common good long before nation-states existed as they do today. The goal is a more solid, more truthful foundation for every other policy and practice that follows. 14.2 Indigenous Sovereignty, Treaties, and Pathways Forward. Indigenous sovereignty is not a metaphor but a set of recognized rights and responsibilities that predate the Canadian state. It envisions nations that speak for themselves, govern according to distinct laws, and participate as full partners in decisions that affect their lands, peoples, and futures. The framework has always been nation to nation, in spirit, even as colonial systems sought to manage or erase Indigenous authority. Treaties, historic and modern, anchor these relationships in binding commitments, obligations, and mutual accountability. Recognizing sovereignty is also recognizing the diversity of Indigenous polities, from nations in treaty relationships to communities with distinct governance structures and legal traditions. Treaties tell a long, continuing story. The numbered treaties of the 19th and early 20th centuries created a framework for peaceful modality and resource sharing, but they were often interpreted through a colonial lens that limited Indigenous autonomy. Modern land claims and self-government agreements offer pathways to rebuild that autonomy within Canadian law, not outside it. Landmark legal decisions, such as the Tsilhottin Nation v. British Columbia, 2014, affirmed Aboriginal title and demonstrated that Indigenous rights can be legally defended and negotiated in Canadian courts. The Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, 1993, stands as a tangible example of how a comprehensive agreement can transform governance, education, and economic development in a northern region. These moments show that sovereignty can be exercised responsibly, with robust consultation and clear standards for collaboration. Pathways forward are practical as well as principled. Co-governance models, revenue-sharing arrangements, language and cultural protections, and child welfare reforms are not concessions but essential elements of a fair partnership. Modern treaties and self-government agreements are vehicles to align governance with Indigenous laws and worldviews while upholding Canadian constitutional order. Communities and the broader public benefit when Indigenous laws, stewardship knowledge, and Western legal concepts operate in complementarity rather than in tension. The aim is durable, mutually respectful arrangements that empower Indigenous nations to shape policies that affect their lands and futures. 14.3 Gender, Sexuality, and Civil Rights across the nation. Gender and sexuality intersect with Indigenous rights in powerful, complex ways. Two-Spirit people, a traditional Indigenous understanding of gender diversity, remind us that many nations held nuanced roles for people who did not fit inside binary categories. Recognizing Two-Spirit identities in contemporary policy and education honors this history and broadens concepts of civil rights for all Canadians. The ongoing work to address gender-based violence in Indigenous communities is central to reconciliation, because safety and dignity are prerequisites for thriving cultures and futures. Legal and social progress has unfolded alongside persistent challenges. The 1982 Constitution and subsequent amendments opened space for equality, while the Indian Act and related policies gradually evolved to remove discriminatory provisions that limited women's status and rights in some contexts. The 2010s and 2020s brought further reforms and a growing movement toward inclusive leadership, language rights, and recognition of Indigenous governance in areas such as health, education, and justice. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, MILG, released a comprehensive report in 2019, calling for systemic changes, accountability, and healing supports. While strides have been made, many Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people continue to face disproportionate violence and discrimination, reminding us that civil rights work remains urgent and unfinished. Nationally, civil rights advances are interwoven with Indigenous rights and with broader social movements. Same-sex marriage became legal nationwide in 2005, and this momentum has encouraged more inclusive policies across provinces and Indigenous communities. Yet rights advances are not evenly distributed. Communities differ in resources, access to services, and cultural contexts. The path forward lies in listening to Indigenous leaders and activists, expanding protections that reflect diverse identities, and ensuring that institutions, courts, schools, health systems, are responsive to the realities of Indigenous peoples and Two-Spirit communities. The goal is not mere legal parity but full inclusion in civic life, governance, and cultural expression. 14.4 A shared future, policy, practice, and everyday hope. A shared future is built as much in policy rooms as it is on a classroom bench, in a clinic, or around a kitchen table. Policy frameworks like the National Indigenous Languages Act, 2019, signal intent to revitalize languages that are living, dynamic, and deeply tied to identity. Complementary efforts, community-led language nests, school immersion programs, and digital resources, bring languages back into daily life and intergenerational exchange. Health and education reforms, public accountability, and meaningful consultation processes ensure that decisions reflect Indigenous priorities and knowledge systems. In practice, reconciliation shows up as daily choices, schools incorporating Indigenous perspectives into curricula, workplaces adopting respectful land acknowledgement practices that are coupled with action, and governments sharing data and resources transparently with Indigenous nations. Partnerships such as Indigenous Guardians programs, land-based learning initiatives, and co-developed conservation projects illustrate how knowledge systems can collaborate to protect the environment while supporting community well-being. The shift from paternalistic policy to true partnership requires humility, long-term commitments, and the willingness to learn from communities about what works and what healing requires. Everyday hope lives in stories of cooperation and resilience. When communities see improved access to clean water, reliable housing, and culturally grounded education, trust deepens and new generations imagine futures rooted in both tradition and innovation. Non-Indigenous Canadians can contribute by listening first, supporting Indigenous-led initiatives, and choosing to learn about, rather than simply observe, Indigenous lives and aspirations. Reconciliation thrives where memory becomes a catalyst for action, where individuals, institutions, and governments translate history into just, practical, and hopeful futures. Conclusion: reconciliation is a continuous practice, not a final destination. It begins with truth-telling that names harms and honors survivors, then moves toward rights that empower Indigenous nations to govern their futures. The paths forward, treaties, sovereignty, co-governance, and language revival, are not abstract concepts but living arrangements that affect schools, courts, and communities every day. The most enduring takeaway is this: a shared future is built through deliberate acts of listening, collaboration, and accountability, followed by daily decisions that show respect for Indigenous rights, histories, and aspirations. If readers carry this spirit into classrooms, workplaces, and families, Canada can become a place where reconciliation is embedded in how we teach, govern, and live together. Chapter 15: Canada in the Global Century. Sections. Section 15.1: A Global Canada, Trade, Diplomacy, and Leadership Abroad. Section 15.2: Innovation, Inclusion, and Economic Adaptation. Section 15.3: Culture, Community, and Civic Life in a Digital Era. Section 15.4: Looking Ahead, Values, Challenges, and Opportunities. Introduction. Canada stands at the hinge of a fast-changing world, where decisions made in Ottawa echo across oceans and continents. The global century has sharpened the country's sense of purpose, trade and diplomacy as instruments of practical influence, innovation and inclusion as engines of growth, and culture and civic life shaped by digital connectivity. This chapter traces how a nation of millions, spread from Atlantic to Pacific to Arctic, has stayed true to core values while adapting to new global dynamics. The journey is not a single achievement but a continuing story of balance, between openness and security, between opportunity and responsibility, between local life and global horizons. 15.1a Global Canada, Trade, Diplomacy, and Leadership Abroad. Canada's economic lifelines stretch beyond its borders, tying communities to new markets and ideas. Trade deals like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with the European Union have expanded Canada's reach and provided ballast during global shifts. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, has helped stabilize North American trade in a volatile era, while Arctic shipping and resource development place Canada at the frontier of new commerce and governance. In diplomacy, Canada has balanced alliance with independence, leaning into multilateral institutions and global norms to moderate conflict and advance shared prosperity. Canada's leadership in global forums rests on a long-standing preference for collaborative problem-solving. From UN peacekeeping and humanitarian aid to climate diplomacy and development assistance, Canada has sought to be a constructive voice rather than a lone ranger. Arctic governance offers a concrete example. Canada works with Arctic nations to address climate change, safe shipping, and Indigenous rights in a region where science and security walk hand in hand. Beyond policy, Canada's example in immigration, humanitarian action, and cultural openness demonstrates that national strength can be civically anchored in global stewardship. Leadership abroad also means paying attention to the power of small acts. A Canadian decision to support a peacekeeping mission, fund a climate initiative, or host refugees becomes a ripple in the broader human story. The global century magnifies how a nation's values become a diplomatic asset, translating into credibility, partnerships, and practical outcomes. In this sense, Canada's global role is not a show of force but a promise kept, to contribute to a more stable, prosperous, and humane international order. 15.2 Innovation, Inclusion, and Economic Adaptation. The modern Canadian economy thrives on a culture of practical experimentation. Universities, research institutes, and startups push into clean technology, digital health, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing, turning ideas into usable goods and services. Tech clusters in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and across smaller cities show how collaboration between government, business, and academia can accelerate opportunity without sacrificing social cohesion. Yet innovation alone is not enough. Inclusion must be built into the system from the start. Immigration has been Canada's most enduring economic accelerant. A selective, evidence-based approach to talent helps fill gaps in skills while enriching the social fabric with diverse perspectives. Programs aimed at welcoming entrepreneurs, researchers, and workers, combined with strong language and settlement supports, convert newcomers into productive contributors. At the same time, Canada's commitment to multiculturalism, Indigenous reconciliation, and gender equity shapes where opportunities are created and who benefits from them. The result is an economy that adapts to climate realities, global competition, and shifting consumer needs without losing social coherence or fairness. Economic adaptation in the global century also means reshaping traditional strengths to meet new goals. Resource sectors are increasingly integrated with sustainability standards and clean tech innovation, while digital platforms enable new services, logistics, and provincial investment. The overarching narrative is one of balance: protect competitive industries, invest in people, and guard the social fabric that makes growth meaningful. In Canada, prosperity and inclusion are not opposing poles but twin engines driving a resilient, forward-looking economy. 15.3 Culture, community, and civic life in a digital era. Digital life has reimagined how Canadians tell stories, share values, and participate in public life. National institutions, public broadcasting, libraries, and cultural organizations embrace streaming and online access while preserving local languages and regional identities. The result is a vibrant cultural ecosystem where Canadian stories travel far beyond national borders, reinforcing the idea that culture is both a source of pride and a bridge to others. In parallel, Indigenous media and multilingual communities contribute to a richer national conversation, elevating voices that had long been on the social margins. The digital era also tests democratic life with new challenges and opportunities. Social media amplifies civic engagement but can also magnify misinformation and division. Canadians respond by strengthening media literacy, protecting privacy, and designing governance that helps institutions remain trusted and accountable. Data stewardship and AI ethics emerge as central conversations: how to balance innovation with rights, how to ensure accountability for automated decisions, and how to preserve the public character of essential services. Across campuses, neighborhoods, and town halls, civic life evolves in ways that demand both critical thinking and compassionate leadership. Cultural policy, arts funding, and community initiatives illustrate how Canada translates global currents into local meaning. Public support for diverse arts, bilingual and Indigenous programming, and accessible culture reinforces a sense of belonging in a country that is increasingly plural. The digital shift also invites Canadians to imagine new forms of community, virtual events, hybrid learning, and cross-border collaborations that strengthen social ties while expanding horizons. In these ways, culture remains both a mirror of who Canadians are and a compass for who they hope to become. 15.4 Looking ahead, values, challenges, and opportunities. The path forward in the global century asks Canadians to translate intention into impact. Climate change, demographic change, and rapid technological advancement demand adaptable policy, bold leadership, and inclusive governance. The country's commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, expanded immigration pathways, and protections for privacy and personal freedom will shape both domestic well-being and international credibility. The challenge is to sustain momentum, to invest in people and communities, to modernize institutions without eroding trust, and to anchor global engagement in everyday life. Canada faces opportunities that hinge on practical choices. Building resilient, low-emission industries that still create good jobs, expanding digital literacy for all ages, and ensuring that urban and rural communities alike share in opportunity are central tasks. In foreign policy, maintaining constructive influence as a middle power means choosing partnerships wisely, upholding international law, and using diplomacy to resolve conflicts, protect human rights, and foster shared prosperity. At home and abroad, Canada's future depends on a disciplined, values-driven approach, openness paired with responsibility, innovation guided by ethics, and community life strengthened by inclusion. Conclusion: the global century challenges Canada to be both steadfast and flexible. It invites the nation to steward its strengths: universal health care, social safety nets, talented people, and a reputation for fair play, while embracing the changes that sustain relevance in a connected world. The narrative of Canada in this era is not a single triumph but a continual practice of listening, learning, and acting with purpose. If the past anchors the Canadian story, the future asks for a bold, principled, and practical imagination that keeps people at the center of every decision. Chapter 16, Conclusion, Weaving the Threads into a Living Narrative. Sections. Section 16.1, The Through Lines Across Time, Recurring Themes That Hold. Section 16.2, Voices Yet Heard, Gaps, Ambiguities, and New Questions. Section 16.3, Reading Canada Forward, How History Can Inform Today. Section 16.4, A Final Thought, Caring for a Country Through Its Stories. Introduction. In this final chapter, we pull together the threads the book has traced: land, nation, and the people whose lives knit Canada into a continuous story. History is not a museum display but a living conversation, where voices echo across generations and shift with every new discovery. By weaving these conversations into a living narrative, we glimpse a country that grows through listening, revision, and action. Our aim is not to conclude the story but to equip readers to carry it forward with care and curiosity. The through lines we've followed are not flat lines but rivers that bend, meet, and carve the landscape. They include relationships with the land and its diverse peoples, the rhythms of migration, the struggle for rights and recognition, and the ongoing reimagining of belonging. Together they reveal a Canada that is formed by, and only truly for, those who participate in its story. As we close this book, we listen for voices that history has sometimes left on the periphery and ask what those voices can teach us about today. 16.1 The Through Lines Across Time, Recurring Themes That Hold. The story of Canada repeats itself in patterns that remain surprisingly stable across generations. Constitutional arrangements, bilingual identities, and a habit of compromise endure not as relics but as living practices guiding everyday life. Attending to land and environment has long shaped policy, from early settlement to modern stewardship and climate adaptation. Indigenous sovereignty and reconciliation movements remind us that agreements are more than documents, they are living obligations that require ongoing attention and action. Migration and pluralism continually reshape communities, turning small towns into multicultural mosaics. Cities become laboratories where language, faith, foodways, and arts mingle in daily life. Economic shifts, from resource extraction to service and knowledge sectors, demand adaptable institutions and inclusive governance. These themes persist because they answer enduring questions about belonging, usefulness, and responsibility, even as the country changes with each generation. 16.2 Voices yet heard, gaps, ambiguities, and new questions. No national narrative can claim to include everyone in equal measure. Gaps remain where treaty histories, frontline labor, Black Canadian experiences, Indigenous maternal knowledge, and immigrant stories have been underrepresented. Ambiguities arise when our sources conflict, memory and record sometimes disagree, or when progress emerges from painful compromises. As historians, we test assumptions by seeking marginalized voices, revisiting archives, and asking what-if questions about alternative paths. New questions push us to look beyond major events to daily life in small places. What if Indigenous knowledge and migrant labor stories take center stage in understanding national development? How did rural and Indigenous governance intersect with urban policy in shaping services and justice? These questions invite readers to participate actively in history, not merely receive it, and to recognize that the past is a living classroom for the present. 16.3 Reading Canada Forward, How History Can Inform Today. History offers tools for citizenship, not just memory. By tracing patterns of inclusion, rights, and accountability, readers can see what works in policy and what wounds require attention. We can apply lessons from past reforms to present debates about reconciliation, education, healthcare, and climate resilience. Storytelling becomes a bridge between past and policy, helping people imagine possibilities and test ideas in the light of experience. Consider immigration and settlement. Welcoming new Canadians has often accompanied prosperity when paired with respectful integration. In urban planning, history urges us to design spaces that honor language diversity, mobility, and accessibility. In culture and media, it calls for narratives that resist stereotype and expand the spectrum of represented voices. In environmental stewardship, historical memory guides sustainable choices that balance growth with care for the land. 16.4 A final thought, caring for a country through its stories. To tell Canada's story well is to practice care, humility, and responsibility. We owe future generations an archive that is honest about both triumphs and failings, and that foregrounds voices long overlooked. This honesty requires ongoing dialogue with communities whose histories were marginalized or erased. We can cultivate a culture of memory that informs action, through education, policy, and daily choices that reflect our shared values. As readers and citizens, you become custodians of these narratives. Document local histories, support libraries and archives, and share stories with younger generations. Ask questions, seek corroboration, and let curiosity guide your civic imagination. In doing so, you help weave a national story that is resilient, inclusive, and living.